Judith Swisser and Elaine Unterhalter, who are here to support us today. It's my great pleasure to thank and welcome our distinguished speakers today, who I will introduce in a moment. But before that, I would like to say a few words about where we are at the moment in our seminar series. As I said, this is the fourth of a series of 6 seminars. Prior to what we are going to discuss today, we considered several aspects of the philosophical reflections on child poverty and education. We started our seminar series by highlighting some of the main theoretical, ethical, and more practice-based questions about child poverty and education. And our opening roundtable shed light on considerations about child labor, or the need to reconsider understandings of child labor in relation to issues of poverty in childhood. It also drew attention to the complexity, the multidimensionality of child poverty, both in relation to aspects of understanding child poverty whilst enacting practice and policies that could counteract its negative effects. And we saw, for example, the effect of child poverty and some of the policies in South Africa, and we analyzed the multidimensionality and intersectionality of child poverty and some of its effects on gender issues, in particular in South Africa. We also analyzed the complex role of educational institutions, and in particular schooling and schools and teachers in their complex role, both as carers or as caring institutions and teaching institutions. And we highlighted how the pandemic, for example, has exacerbated some of the inherent structural weaknesses that our schooling system, particularly in England, were already having. And finally, we looked at some of the normative questions that inform or might inform the debate on child poverty in education, and particularly in parallel to questions about health justice. So how best can we understand the inequalities relating to child poverty in education? How best can we not only understand, but also measure and perhaps counteract those inequalities? Are those inequalities the result of schooling institutions only, or are there wider societal concerns? And can school really address all the normative and practical aspects, ethical aspects that emerge from poverty in childhood? Our second seminar introduced the voices of practitioners, and we had 4 presentations about aspects of practice trying to address the effects of child poverty and in education. So we looked at, for example, the cost of the school day. We had a very informative session presented by Child Poverty Action Group, Dave Bradley, who talked to us about the cost of school, the hidden cost of going to school in England. So in education systems which are free at the point, or should be free at the point of fruition. We looked also at questions about questions in Ethiopia and in Mozambique. So in countries with relative or more pressing concerns of poverty, and countries where poverty intersects poverty in childhood intersects with many other elements of social deprivation and economic as well as social problems. And finally, we heard the voice of a head teacher in England who tried to articulate all the difficulties faced by schools, and particularly in leadership roles, in trying to address the complex experiences of children when they live in conditions of poverty. Our third seminar, so a more focused attention on questions of justice. So, for example, my own paper tried to address how we can conceptualize lay educational inequalities pertaining to child poverty, and looked at possible ways of measuring it in relation to insights offered by the capability approach. We had a contribution from experiences and projects in South Africa, again, focusing on the role of institutions in trying to address the problems experienced by children in poverty in South Africa, and the various dimensions that both economics and sociology can bring to the fore in considering these questions. We also had another contribution that looked at the parallels between questions of health, addressing health inequalities globally, and what it might be to promote the importance of literacy as a very important element of addressing child poverty on a global scale. And finally, we looked also at possible project of deschooling and what a conception of deschooling or an idea of deschooling, or more community-based projects in some parts of the world which haven't got such a strong state system of schooling, might add to the general debate. So we have gone through, if you like, many of the normative underpinning questions in the debate, in the relationship between child poverty and educational institutions, both normatively and theoretically, but also in relation to practice and institutional designs. Now, today, we are going to focus on questions of status, voice, and representation of children in poverty and their education. So we are really focusing our attention now on how children in poverty, whether they have voice, what kind of representations do we have of their status. And I am delighted to introduce our distinguished four speakers who are Anka Geos, Elaine Chase, Rachel Rosen and Eve Dixon, and Jenny Parks. And I will be introducing, as I said previously, each of them as we go through the seminar. So I hope that you will enjoy this very rich and interesting session that, again, brings us along our journey in the analysis of the normative and philosophical questions about child poverty and education. Many of you, and we're very grateful for that, have been with us since the very beginning. So you all know that, but I'm also repeating this and saying this for those who have joined us for today only. We are you're very welcome to post your comments on the chat, as well as to raise your hand for any questions you may have, or just if we miss you in your asking questions, please unmute yourself and just ask for attention. We usually have 20 minutes for presentations, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers after each presentation. At 4:30, we will have a plenary. So we will have all our speakers discussing questions and issues with you, with the audience, and among themselves. So I hope this is all sort of agreeable. And finally, this seminar is sponsored and funded by the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain. As ever, we acknowledge its support very gratefully. And if you would like to join the society, we have sent a link to that effect in your invitation for today. So without further ado, and me waffling around, please let me introduce our first speaker today, who is Anka Geos. Anka is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Central European University in Vienna. She's a moral and political philosopher whose research focuses on questions of justice, child rearing and the normative significance of personal relationships. She has published very widely on issues to do with the special goods of childhood and parenting and the ethics of the family. And she's co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Childhood and Children. She's currently writing a monograph on child-centered child rearing. And today, Anka is going to talk to us about poverty in the special goods of childhood. Why does it matter, and how can schools help? Anka, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here and letting me participate, contribute to this wonderful project. I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides. And let me start by saying that as I see it, my contribution to this project will be to think about one particular dimension of poverty, namely poverty in what I'm calling, following many philosophers today, the special goods of childhood. I'm going to start by explaining just a couple of my assumptions and hopefully trying to give you a first glimpse of what I mean by special goods of childhood and also by poverty. So the first assumption that I'm making, the first major assumption, is that we are actually caring about poverty for several reasons, but the most stringent reason we have to care about poverty is because we care about justice. So I assume that if we were to live in conditions that were so scarce that we couldn't bring everybody above the level of some kind of poverty threshold, then we would have one reason less to worry so much about poverty, because then justice couldn't require us to bring everybody above the level of poverty, wherever we put the poverty line. But I also assume that at least people who live in developed countries in the world are not in such situation. And this is our most foremost practical reason for worrying about poverty. And this is also a justification for talking about in this talk, referring in this talk mostly to justice rather than to poverty and such. But I'm very happy to problematize this in questions and answers a bit more. And then the other major assumption I'm making is that children are not unfinished adults, or at least unfinished. It's a traditional view of children, according to which a child is nothing more than an not fully mature human being, somebody who has not fully developed physically, biologically, but also emotionally, intellectually, and socially. And I'm not disputing here this assumption. I'm actually defining children as people who are not yet fully mature in these important dimensions. But following a sort of new and flourishing trend in philosophy over the past 20 years at least, I assume that childhood is also a time in our life when we may have access to some special sources of value. And this is partly in virtue of having some kind of capacities which we are losing fully or partially as we grow up. So on this view, children are not mere unfinished adults, but also human beings who are capable of finding values and enjoying well-being in virtue of these capacities, which may be fully inaccessible or just very limitedly accessible to us when we grow up, when we are fully mature. So I'm going to talk about the special goods of childhood more in detail later in the paper, but just to give you a sense of what I have in mind when I'm talking about the special goods of childhood, what kinds of sources of values I assume that children have either unique or privileged access to. This is a list of the goods that philosophers have recently considered. So some people talked about how children can enjoy fully trusty intimacy with their caregivers, a kind of intimacy that the quality of which can't be recreated in adult relationships. Other philosophers have focused more on children's innocence, especially in sexual innocence, or in a sense of a future as limitless that apparently children have to a much larger extent than adults, if adults can have this sense of time as limitless at all. But also some of the goods, the ones that I'm mostly interested in, and this is why they are in bold here, are goods that are more agential, have to do with exercising one's agency in a particular way. Some of them, some philosophers are talking about children's unique kind of playfulness and carefreeness as sources of unique sources of value. Many are talking about the unusually high levels of openness to experimentation that children have, which most adults would have lost, but also to children's vivid imagination, allowing them to lead very rich fantasy lives. And then there is a lot of focus on specific kinds of creativity that children have. Their creativity as learners, an ability to learn in an unstructured way, to a much faster pace and in a much more creative way, apparently, than adults do. But also, according to some people, children have very high levels of artistic creativity and even philosophical creativity, insofar as this refers to their ability to ask questions rather than pursue in a consequent way any kind of such questions. So I'm not going here to argue about why these kinds of special goods are cogent. I'm just relying on the many accounts of other people who have explained both why these things are good and why they are mostly or uniquely available to children. In this talk, I'm going to try to do two things to explain why there is a case for thinking that children are owed access to these goods as a matter of justice, why we should be interested in children's rights to such goods, not just in how the goods contribute to good childhoods. And then I will say a few things about why we may think that schools of all the various agents who have duties of justice to children, why schools in particular have to make sure that children have access to these goods. So the first question is why should we think that these types of goods, assuming they are good, should be part of what philosophers call the metric of justice. So the metric of justice refers to those goods, the distribution of which comes under the remit of justice, the goods that people have rights to, and therefore we all have duties to provide to them. And there is a broad consensus in philosophy that when it comes to adults, these goods, which constitute the metric of justice, have mostly to do with opportunities rather than with outcomes. So the general consensus is that the goods that are owed to adults are all-purpose means goods, the type of things that you may want more of rather than less of, because they are going to be instrumentally useful to you, instrumentally valuable to you, no matter what kind of aims you're pursuing. However you want to live your life, you will want, for instance, more rather than less income and wealth, and you will need to have civil and political rights protected. You will need to have job opportunities, most likely, and you will need to have things like healthcare or some disposable time in order to enjoy your rights, to make full use of them. So the general idea is that for adults, when it comes to adults, justice will require that we offer them goods that constitute opportunities rather than outcome, partly because we give some role to personal responsibility in how they make use of these goods, and partly because we believe it is not legitimate to impose particular outcomes on adults. We think that respect for their autonomy means that we should allow them to bypass, to turn down offers of good things for them. By contrast, when it comes to children, I think we mostly agree that all-purpose means are not always sufficient. And when they are owed to children, they are owed to them for developmental reasons. So the most important bit here is the not always sufficient qualification. So usually we believe that children are owed not mere opportunities, but actually good outcomes. So if an adult were to decide to go on hunger strike, perhaps we would be required to always respect this decision, even if it entails very bad outcomes for the adult in question. But when it comes to a child, we may think that a point may come when we have to decide that enough is enough, and we may have to intervene to make sure the child is not starving. This is not to say that children are not owed all-purpose means, but most likely they are owed them mostly on developmental grounds. We think that children have to slowly learn how to take charge of their lives and how to decide how to turn opportunities into outcomes for themselves. However, above and beyond the all-purpose means that we may owe to children, we also owe them particular outcomes, or at least this is the general view, and I don't depart from it. But then the question is, what outcomes exactly do we owe children? And I think we owe two different kinds of outcomes to children. Again, about the first type of outcome, there is very broad consensus, at least among liberal philosophers, namely that we owe to children those kinds of things that are preparing them properly for maturity. I call them here preparatory goods, and some of them have to do with children's ability to understand justice, to know what are their rights and other people's rights and their duties, and to develop the general disposition to comply with justice. And another part of the preparatory goods that we owe children is what they need in order to actually be able to pursue a good life for themselves. First, to decide, to make up their mind about what is a good life for themselves, and second, to have the effective means to pursue this idea. So they include physical and emotional health, emotional maturity, sufficient knowledge about themselves and about the world such that they can choose and make up their minds about how they want to live. Well, in addition to these preparatory goods, however, there is an increasing consensus that we also owe children something else, namely good childhoods. We need to make sure that they are enjoying well-being, not only qua future adults, not only those kinds of means that they will need to use in order to pursue good lives when they grow up, but also good childhoods. And I think there's an interesting discussion to be had here about what it means for a childhood to be good. I just assume that part of what it means is that it's a good preparation for what's to come, for adulthood. So we, in order to give children good childhoods, we'll need to give them many of these things that have developmental value. And many perhaps of the things that are on the list of my special goods of childhood are partly good because they have developmental value. They help children mature in a better rather than worse way. But the assumption I'm making, and again, that's a growing consensus, I think, about this, is that above and beyond what children need in order to acquire good adulthood, there are also some goods that have a value that would be very valuable even for children, for instance, who unfortunately are never going to make it into adulthood. And maybe this is a good test to think about this issue in terms of what would we owe a child who unfortunately is never going to be an adult, who's very likely to die before they reach adulthood. So these are the special goods of childhood, which I think have three features that make them the special goods of childhood. The first feature, which I have mentioned already, is that children have either unique or privileged access to them. My view is that there are no goods that are only good for children, and that are under perhaps very special circumstances, adults too can enjoy them, although perhaps to a lesser extent. So if you think about innocence or care or being able to be carefree, some philosophers believe that these things are only accessible to children. I think this is not necessarily the case, but in any case, I agree that most of the goods on the list are such that children have a much better access to them. And at least with respect to some goods, the agential ones, I think this has to do in part with the very fact that they are biologically not yet mature. So the stage of development of very young brains, for instance, are such that they allow you to be a lot more creative, perhaps at the expense of being less able to execute plans to the end and pursue certain projects in a very systematic way. But some of the goods of childhood, I assume, are accessible to children in a privileged way in virtue of their biological immaturity. The second feature is that these goods make a very significant contribution to a person's lifetime well-being. They're not just the extra candy. They are things that are not trivially important for a good life. So you may think that creativity is something like this. You may think that a life goes much better for the person who's the subject of that life if they can enjoy a high level of artistic or philosophical or general creativity. And the third feature is that the contribution of these goods is unique in the sense that it can't be just made up for, the loss of these goods can't be just made up for other kinds of goods. You can't just easily substitute the loss of a certain good from this list by giving children, either qua children or when they grow up as adults, something else instead. And if there are goods that are defined by all these three features, then you may say that missing out on them constitutes an unjust advantage for the person's life as a whole. Again, there is quite broad consensus that when we look at the unit of time on which we assess whether a person has had their fair share or not, or even when we assess whether a person has been subject to poverty or not, we must look not at particular moments in a person's time or even at a longer stage of life, like a few years, but perhaps overall at the entire lifetime of that particular individual. So the idea here is that if there are some kinds of goods that if they are not being enjoyed during your childhood, they won't be able to be compensated for later on. And what we're really interested is how people fare relative to each other, but also relative to a certain level of a threshold of poverty when we look at their entire lives. Again, that's the special goods of childhood, which was initially in the presentation only here. And the only additional thought here is that the goods that are in bold, on which I am focused on, I'm most interested in this talk, are goods that have to do with children's agency. So one can enjoy them only to the extent to which one can be an agent to some degree. And one can enjoy them only if one has enough unstructured time to pursue these good things, to be playful, to be allowed to be at least at times carefree, to experiment with things, to develop and learn, to create beautiful things, or to ask philosophical questions, or indeed to engage in fantasy play. And the reason why children need a lot of unstructured time in order to enjoy these goods is because the enjoyment of these goods is not a goal-oriented process, but rather a process-oriented activity. So here is my proposal with respect to how not to make children poor in the special goods of childhood. It's a proposal which has two levels. The one is the minimal requirement that schools don't make children poor. Schools or other agents indeed who may be in charge with ensuring that children have their share of the special goods of childhood. So the at least not poor demand is that children be allowed sufficient time that is not taken up with goal-oriented activities, including homework, which would crowd out any unstructured time that's needed for them to enjoy the special goods of childhood. The more demanding requirement is that children be made rich in the special goods of childhood. And for schools, this would require that there is enough space in the curricula for scientific, artistic, and philosophical activities that are not expected to lead to measurable outcomes. So the thought here is not merely that children be given these kinds of activities, but that they be given the opportunity to pursue them in ways that are not goal-oriented, that are not going to end up in some kind of measurement. And this is a requirement for them to actually enjoy the full value of these goods. So the next question is why schools in particular? And I think that it's I own an explanation, especially given that there are lots of agents who have duties of justice towards children, who should make sure that children are not poor, and moreover that perhaps the children enjoy equally good childhoods. There are the parents, of course, but there are also lots of state institutions, financial policies that make sure children are not living in material poverty, and environmental and healthcare institutions. And then the school is just one institution on this list. Well, I believe there are several reasons why schools have a special role to play when it comes to delivering the special goods of childhood to children. One reason is that for good reasons, school attendance is mandatory, and moreover, it takes up a very important part of children's lives. Children spend increasingly larger amounts of time in school as they grow up. And indeed, for most children, at least in developed countries, I think the school may be the only agent who has the power to crowd out the special goods of childhood. Parents don't control, especially for older children, parents can't control the use of all children's time because much of this time is spent at school. But schools, at least indirectly, can end up controlling for all practical purposes most of the children's time because they can put requirements on children even when children are not at home. So schools are very powerful agents when it comes to deciding how much unstructured time there is in a child's life. perhaps more than any other agent. Second, schools, I assume, are also the best place agents to deliver many of the special goods of childhood. First, for the simple reason that perhaps many of these kinds of goods are best pursued under the guidance of specialized adults. So probably children play, they certainly learn a lot and explore a lot, even with no adult supervision. But there are other kinds of goods like pursuing aesthetic or philosophical or even scientific forms of creativity, which may depend on having some kind of guidance, sometimes very non-intrusive guidance from other adults. The more important reason, however, I think has to do with the incentive structure of other agents who are in charge with children's lives. So here I assume that very often parents have individual incentives to put more effort and more attention into preparing children for good adulthood, especially in very competitive societies in which access to many other goods for adults is determined by their market participation. So parents may have very serious incentives to make sure that their children do well at schools in those respects which are being measured, that they are having high grades and that they are very competitive for accessing higher education and then the labor market. And they may have an individual incentive to do this at the expense of children's free time. And this, I take it, is a very difficult collective active action problem, because it's a form of a race in which the more other parents engage in this type of cultivation of their children in order to make them successful adults later on, the more each individual parent has to pay a high price if they make sure their children have lots of unstructured time. And again, I assume that schools, partly because they are in charge with so much of children's time, can help us out of this collective problem by simply earmarking sufficient unstructured time for all children that's protected from the other demands that children have to face in school or from their parents. I'm not sure whether I have spoken for 20 minutes yet, but I'm very happy to stop now, and I'm very curious to hear more from you, especially about when it comes to how children themselves can participate in enjoying these kinds of goods, which is one of the topics which I haven't actually addressed in this talk.
Thank you very much, Anka, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Whilst I wait for our audience to come up with, I've got a question from Nico, so I will not use my privilege as a chair to ask you a few questions that your brilliant presentation has raised for me. I'll hand over to Nico. Nico Brando, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or would you prefer to pose it in the chat?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you,
Thank
Nico.
you. Thank you, Lorella. Anka, hi, how are you? Thank you so much for your presentation. Great to see you virtually. I had a question about obligatoriness of the goods of ensuring the goods of childhood. So basically, the question is that I understand the value of these goods. So I understand that these are things that intuitively seem, it would be nice for children to have. However, I am wondering whether there are justice claims for them to be secured, because there seems to be an assumption in your claim that because these are goods, they should be, let's say, there should be institutions that are in charge of securing these goods no matter what. I'm wondering whether you could expand on what makes these goods fundamental claims that impose duties of justice towards others, and especially towards public institutions as schools. And I had another second question regarding how would the poverty element play as an issue in the securing of these goods, because so from your presentation it seems that the main limitation to the securing of the special goods is the fact that schools maybe are too objective focused and they don't address these issues too much. And also they're the best instrument to secure it because it's time where they could be it could be used to promote these agency goods of childhood. But I'm wondering, for example, in the case of children in poverty, where actually the access to school is very limited. I mean, you could say, well, maybe they actually the fact of not going to school maybe allows them this free time that allows them to explore their agential abilities in a way that school wouldn't enable them. I don't know. I'm just like an open question, asking you to reflect on this. Thank you so much, Anka.
Hi, Nico. Thanks a lot for the questions. I am not sure I fully understood the second one, but let me first speak to the first, and then you tell me if there's still something to be answered in relation to the second question. I think you're right that one part of my argument, which could be more spelled out, is why exactly I think these goods are part of the metric of justice. Why is it? Why are they important not just for good childhoods, but also for getting children what they are owed in terms of justice? So, as I said in the beginning, I think we care about poverty mostly because we care about justice. And I also think that justice requires children to be given equally good childhoods. Maybe justice doesn't require equality for adults, certainly not equality of outcome, but it does require, I think, equality of outcome for children. And then the assumption is that what makes a childhood go well, to some extent, are these special goods of childhood. And then there is another assumption that's hidden, that many children actually do enjoy these goods of childhood. This is why we know they are good for children, because we look at the children who do enjoy them. And if so, then it is unjust that some children enjoy these goods perhaps to a large extent, while others don't have access to these goods at all. And then in this case, if justice requires us to give children equally good childhoods, and if these goods are making such an important contribution to the quality of a childhood, then we have to make sure that all children have roughly the same enjoyment of such goods. At least if they have the capabilities to enjoy these goods. I don't want to say that there are no children who just can't enjoy some of the goods on the list. This doesn't mean to say, as you suggested in the question, that we ought to provide these goods to children no matter what. I'm not saying that these are the most important determinants of the quality of a childhood. That would be quite a silly claim to make. And obviously there are other things that may be more important, or certainly at least more urgent to provide to children. Obviously, basic things like security and food and shelter and healthcare have to come first.
Thank you, Anka. There are many other questions that your answers are actually raising for me, and I'm sure for many others, but I would like to take one more question from Alan Wilson, just trying to stay within the allocated time, because we can come back to any of these very interesting issues during the plenary. So if that's okay, could I please ask Alan Wilson to ask his question now, and to ask it short, in brief form, and in an equally succinct answer, please. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, and thanks for the talk. Yeah, I was just wondering on the topic of thinking about kind of difficult cases, like so kind of extreme poverty cases where lack of resources might mean that we can't do all that justice would require. I was wondering if you have a view on like what the kind of priority weighting should be between the kind of preparatory goods for children and the special goods of childhood. Are there going to be some kind of difficult cases where we just have to say, okay, well, let's just do our best to make sure this child can have a fulfilled life in adulthood, and that's going to be kind of a tragic case in terms of being able to help them enjoy a good childhood? Or would you resist that and say sometimes it'd be worth trading off some preparatory goods for some childhood goods? Any thoughts on that? And thanks again for the talk.
Hi, Ellen, nice to see you too, and thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, so the short answer is I can't really give a proper answer, because this would require a full axiology, which would come with lots of value commitments about what makes a human life go well on the whole, and what kind of goods are more important in it. My temptation is to say that yes, when there are trade-offs to be made in a child's life between preparatory goods and the non-preparatory goods, then it would be wrong to sacrifice the good childhood, everything that makes a childhood go well above and beyond what makes it go well as a preparation for adulthood for the sake of a good adulthood. But I don't think that this conflict, I think this conflict can be overestimated, because many of these goods are also having a lot of developmental value. So being creative in an unstructured, non-goal oriented way is often also going to help you to prepare better for adulthood. That's one reason to think that the tension, the practical trade-off is not so stark. The other reason is that many of these goods are quite cheap to provide. So maybe getting trained adults to help to do philosophy with children is expensive, and it would be a foolish thing to do before making sure that children have the basic necessities. But making sure that children don't have so much homework or so many tests that they never have enough time to play is something that's very materially cheap to provide. The question is how we break out of the collective action coordination problem, which makes teachers and parents always push their children harder towards performance.
Thank you, Anka. Thank you very much for such an excellent introduction to our topic today. And I would like now to introduce our second speaker, who is Elaine Chase. Elaine is Associate Professor in Education, Health and International Development at the UCL Institute of Education. Her research focuses on the sociological dimensions of health, well-being, and the rights of childhood, and individuals and communities, and particularly those most likely to experience marginalization and exclusion. Elaine has published widely on issues including child migrants, poverty, shame, and social exclusion, exploring the interface between policy, practice, and context. She has also worked as health promotion practitioner in the UK and in Namibia. And today she's going to talk to schools as arenas for poverty-related shame, some reflections for educational policy and practice. Elaine, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorella, and thank you to all the organisers of this seminar series, which is excellent, and for the opportunity for sharing some thoughts and ideas today. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully that's going to work okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So it was such a nice opportunity to go back and reflect on some work that's sort of been shelved for the last couple of years in some respects, but still very much alive in many others, and that's related to work that I sort of completed for a number of years, and looking at the intersection between poverty and shame that I'll think about, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But what was really interesting reflecting on this was how much the ideas, and I suppose the sensitization to ideas around shame and poverty, really play out in all the research that I do in educational contexts and in wider community contexts as well. So in terms of overview, I just wanted to give a few insights to the body of work that started really around 2010, led by Robert Walker, who was a colleague when I was at Oxford. And so we worked on the intersection of poverty and shame over a number of years. And then I want to look at some of those insights in relation to schools and education and educational communities as arenas for shame, and how those ideas play out both at a micro and at a macro level as well. So bringing in young people's voices, but then thinking about how they play out at a much more policy level, national and international level. And then I'm going to briefly connect some of those ideas to some bodies of work that I'm currently working on, and then end with thinking about some ways forward around these ideas of applying a shame-proofing lens in educational policies. So the original study was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and UKAID, and was looking at shame, poverty and social exclusion, a comparative study in 7 countries. And so we worked across with colleagues in each of these countries, looking at countries of very different levels of GDP, very different levels of ideas around poverty and material deprivation, but really based around the idea of Amartya Sen that shame is at the absolute core of the idea of poverty. So that in that case, then, irrespective of the level of material deprivation, people should be experiencing it everywhere. And so the countries were as diverse as Norway, Uganda, UK, Pakistan, India, Korea, and China. In that study, we explored the shame-poverty nexus through a range of cultural media. We looked at film, we looked at poetry, we looked at literature, and how these ideas and the connection between shame and poverty were drawn out. We worked very much on the lived experiences of people living in poverty, mostly adults, but in India and in the UK and Uganda, we also engaged the voices of children and young people. And then a third big part of the work was an analysis of anti-poverty policies. And one of the big questions we were asking was that if shame is at the absolute core of the experience of poverty, then what are the implications for anti-poverty policies? How might we make them more dignity enhancing? How might we begin to think about what we've termed shame-proofing them? So I won't go into great detail about the overarching key findings, but just to say that despite very large differences in material deprivation across those countries, the day-to-day experience of poverty and shame related to poverty was very, very similar, despite cultural nuances. And these ideas are kind of published in a range of literature that came out of this work. So the shame of it looks very much at anti-poverty policies and looks at those in each of the countries. The Shame of Poverty is a theoretical work by Robert Walker that really goes into depth into different cultural understandings and meanings around shame and poverty and its relation to poverty. And the Poverty and Shame Global Experiences, edited by myself and my colleague Grace Bantieva Kiyohendo from Makerere, looks at the kind of lived experiences really in each of those countries. In terms of the focus on children and young people, as I said, we conducted interviews with children in Uganda, India, and the UK, and their experiences of shame in different settings, including schools. But young people were not the key focus of the work. We managed to engage them where we could, and I think it would be really good to develop this work further. I mean, and that's an area that I'm very much interested in. There's a paper cited below, which covers some of the kind of key findings of that work in relation to the comparison between Uganda and the UK, but again, drawing out the key similarities in the experience of poverty for those children, irrespective of the very different lives that they were leading. As I said, so shame is about, according to Sen, it's at the irreducible absolutist core in the idea of poverty, the ability to go without shame, and that he sees as absolutely core. When we speak of shame, it's really about a sense of low self-worth made with reference to one's own aspirations and the perceived expectations of others. So it's very much a social emotion, and it's very much linked to people's social relations with others. And so why is shame important? Fundamentally because it's painful. It's a self-conscious emotion and is tied very much to our own self-concept and our own sort of self-esteem. It's experienced in conditions over which individuals have no control or no escape. So we drew the distinction between that and guilt, whereas if we feel guilty, we may perhaps be able to make amends for things we've done or we haven't done, or things that we've said. We can make recompense for that. But the idea around shame is that it's not easy to do that. You don't have control, and therefore there's no escape from it. Who describes it as shame is potentially more pervasive and incapacitating than guilt. It often persists like a psychic scar that stubbornly refuses to heal, which I think captures its sort of essence really well. And importantly, it reduces agency and impacts on physical, mental, and social well-being. So the poverty-shame nexus looks something like this, or might look something like this. Poverty leads to a sense of shame or inadequacy, which leads to a sense of low self-worth and lack of agency. And that lack of agency can reinforce poverty. Shame also leads to social exclusion, and shaming can mean that you're pushed out or excluded by others. So that's a really important distinction in the internal sense, but also its imposition from others, which in itself can lead to low self-worth and social exclusion, low social capital, and again, can feed into the cycle of poverty. The other side to this coin, which is really important to engage with, is shaming by others, by society, by communities, and very importantly, by policies. And unpicking the ways in which that happens is really a really important part of the puzzle. In terms of what's been written about the impacts of poverty on children from a psychological and social perspective, it's a sort of limited but growing body of work, I would argue. There has been an increasing focus on the long-term impacts of poverty for children and young people. There's a reference there to a World Bank report, but it's very much in terms of, it's very often seen in terms of what children need now in order to make them productive and active and engaged adults in the future. There's much less focus on the psychological and social dimensions of the lived experience of poverty on a day-to-day basis and the importance of children's lives in the here and now. Pitila Salva talks about developmental trauma associated with feelings of shame, and Tess Ridge's work is really important in this sense in terms of talking about the hidden effects of embarrassment with deep emotional costs. So she says poverty penetrates deep into the heart of childhood, permeating every facet of children's lives, economic and material deprivation, through the structuring of social relationships, social participation, to the most personal, often hidden aspects of disadvantage associated with sadness and the fear of social difference and marginalization. And that key thing around social difference and marginalization, I think, is what draws those experiences from such diverse parts across the globe to be very much shared experiences. Work from the Young Lives Project, looking at the psychological and social impacts of poverty on children's ability to learn in Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam, showed a consistent link between the extent of poverty experienced by children and feelings of shame at 12 years old, and that feelings of shame were linked to poorer learning outcomes for children at ages 12 and again at 15, when everything else was controlled for. So it seems to be having a very sort of direct impact on people's children's ability to learn in the context of schooling. And just a few sort of vignettes really and insights drawing out these sort of similarities. At the micro level, so day-to-day lived experiences of children. In Uganda, the head teacher sent me home to remind my parents about the exam fees balance that I owed. He categorically told me not to return to school without the money. I went home feeling low, not only because my classmates remained learning, but also for being exposed as a school fees defaulter. My father gave me the money after 2 days, but declined to escort me back to school as requested by the head teacher. I have a feeling the purpose of summoning him was to shame him as well. So these interactions between childhood and families as well come out very, very strongly. Harry in the UK, if you don't have a piece of correct uniform, they will send you home to get changed. I decided that because I haven't got any school trousers at the minute, I'm not going to come in until I get them. What they're not understanding is that I can't always go out and buy new things and that I need. I don't like the teachers, I think they're cruel. And Harry had a long history of non-attending schools, attending schools sporadically, very much tied up to kind of his image and how connected he felt with the school. Preschool meals. I mean, they're obviously a key issue of debate at the moment for children in poverty. But Shani in India talks about the discomfort of taking the midday meal when you're made to feel different in the school. And Anthony in the UK, in a way, it's like being bullied for it at school, because it's like anybody got free school meals And I go, yeah, me. And then everyone will go, oh, you've got free school meals. Oh, you're poor, and benefit bum and stuff like that. Now, this work was done a few years ago now, but it's really interesting that Rebecca O'Connell and Abigail Knight and Julia Brannan's work, which has come out much more recently on food poverty and living hand to mouth, similarly demonstrate very similar experiences of the embarrassment about accessing free school meals in the school setting for children and young people. Schools are also spaces and arenas for constant comparison. Danny, 13 from the UK, said they look much more minted than I am, but that doesn't really bother me. But they want to wind me up by calling me poor, because I get like, when I'm wound up, it's not nice, it's not pleasant. They just try and do it just so that I get kicked out of school. So one of the things that came up across the countries as well was this sense of anger and not being able to kind of cope with the emotions that some of these feelings were generating. There were so many other examples as well around labeling and stigmatizing. Children in Uganda wearing no shoes were called thermometers because they were said to be constantly testing the temperature of the soil. And aid agencies and NGOs providing school bags with labels on them or plastic shoes for children, they became symbols of their poverty. Home and community, not wanting to invite friends home because you were ashamed of the condition of your housing. That was the same in Uganda. Being seen to be a casual laborer outside of school because there wasn't enough income in Uganda. And in the UK, Eloise, who was 18 at the time of being interviewed, but thought back about how she couldn't invite friends home because her mum's bed was in the front room because they had to let out her mother's room to pay the bills. So those are some examples about how shame was playing out at that kind of micro level in the day-to-day lives of children. But these things play out at a macro level as well, very importantly. So in Uganda, as in many other countries as well, there is a universal primary education and a universal secondary education schools. And what our research showed was that children and families will do everything not to attend those schools because while they've widened access and bums on seats in schools, there's been no attention to poverty, to quality, and hence they're schools for the poor. And families do everything that they can to pay for alternatives. Some recent work that I've done a couple of years ago with the same colleagues back in Uganda, looking at exclusion around microfinances and community-based outreach microfinance schemes, found exactly the same thing, that once there was any kind of headway with building up resources, the key priority was to purchase private education and remove children out of universal schools. Conditional cash transfers, okay, they might work well for people that are able to comply with the conditions, but if you can't, then it's another arena for being deeply shamed. So these are conditions of the transfer based on school attendance and performance. They ignore the reasons why people can't comply, and they impact the dignity of the whole family and parent and child relationships. There's growing evidence that unconditional grants reduce stigma, facilitate access to education, and have other positive benefits on children and families' well-being. And just a very quick sort of reflection on other examples of work that I'm currently doing at the moment. So with colleagues in Lebanon, we're looking at supporting education for refugee children and young people and supporting teachers in that work. A key aspect of education there are second shift school systems, so that refugee children are not in the mainstream education system as such, but they attend school at a different time of the day to children from Lebanon and Jordan. So they come in at the end of the day goes on longer, and they're very much separated from Lebanese and children in Jordan. So the work there, very important work being done by people like Hiba Salem, really bringing out the feelings of marginalization and exclusion and being othered in that situation. And May Abu Moghli's work in Lebanon and Jordan is similarly doing the same, this sort of exceptionalism made to feel different. So these are poverty intersecting with all sorts of other inequalities that are going on in people's lives. I've done quite a few studies over the years of young people in and leaving care. They constantly talk about the low expectations there were of them in education. The number of times they were excluded because they couldn't meet the expectations of them for other reasons going on at home or whatever. I've done projects looking at advocacy for children excluded from school as well. Very often there's an intersection with poverty going on there and a lack of understanding about the challenges that the child is facing and that they're facing within the family as well. And a number of the studies, as you mentioned, Lorella, that I'm currently looking at are looking at the experiences of refugee and asylum seeking young people. And many of those are exposed to bullying, exclusion from mainstream education, repeated English language programs, and not being able to engage in education. So hugely stigmatizing and shaming processes going on there. So in terms of ways forward, some of these ideas really speak to the importance around framing, structure, and delivery of anti-poverty policies and education policies. Whether their intentions of shaming are deliberate, which is certainly the case in many policies, or just by chance, they're unintended consequences. But I think it raises questions around how and in what ways can anti-poverty policies have a detrimental effect on children and young people's psychological and social well-being. So through the labeling, the stigmatizing, and accentuating difference. What would policies look like if we apply a shame-proofing lens from the perspective of children and young people? There's some great work going on in Children Northeast. They have this program called Poverty Proofing the School Day. And there's a whole set of resources there where really they've done exactly that. They come very much from the perspectives and views of children living in poverty and thinking about, well, what does it mean if you have World Book Day and kids can't afford the costume? What does it mean if you're on free school meals and you might be able to hide that through an electronic system, but they're packaged up with a brown paper bag to show that they're having the free school meal? So all of these small things that go on in the day-to-day lives of children and how they might be impacted have been thought through. And there's some fantastic tools there. And UNICEF now, the ideas that I think around poverty and shame and the intersection really is gaining traction. There's a UNICEF report out now looking at universal child benefits, and two key chapters look at universal child benefits and children's rights, which is written by Magdalena Sepulveda, who's been the UN rapporteur on extreme poverty for a number of years. And then there's a really important chapter by my colleague Robert Walker and Li Chao Yang, looking at universal child benefits, dignity and shame. So really capturing this kind of the importance of thinking about these. And it touches very much on issues of conditional cash transfers and other issues. And an organization I think that is really at the foreground of addressing some of these issues is ATD Fourth World, which is really about understanding poverty in all its forms from the perspectives of people living in poverty, including children. So I think there's some great work out there, but there's still lots to do. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for such another wonderful presentation. And I have to say that most of what you have explained to us really connects very much with what we've heard, for example, in relation to devising policies that do not stigmatize, therefore show respect for the situation of those most disadvantaged. And for philosophers, this is a very important aspect of, balancing out the possibility of addressing needs and questions for the most disadvantaged without that element of shame, or that element that is can show a lack of respect. What we heard from practitioners in the field in many of our previous presentations is exactly the cover-up that most children put in place in order to obfuscate their own material circumstances of deprivation. And in doing so, they become more difficult to reach. So it's this constant difficult balance, both theoretically and in practice, of trying to address needs without showing a lack of respect. Is the balance between, addressing disadvantage and the respect due to people. There's also this other element that relates to the shame, the internalization of what is, for many, poverty, a result of structural and policy choices that becomes internalized as an individual failure or an inherited failure coming from the family or the circumstances in which one was born. So many of your insights really relate to what we've been talking about previously. But here we have a question from Gary Walsh. Gary, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to Elaine for a great presentation. You almost kind of preempted my question there in your comments. No, it's a good thing. So I was struck by the poverty shame nexus and how it kind of focused largely on that internalization of shame, but then you mentioned shaming as part of that. So I guess my question is, isn't shame in a sense always a consequence of shaming? If we think that poverty is a political choice, because the alternative to that is to engage in a kind of troubled families narrative, whereby we kind of blame families themselves for their own poverty precisely because they've internalized this, and therefore that misses out the kind of the structural reasons and the active shaming within those policy choices that are made.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I would absolutely and totally agree with that. I think it is. I think it's almost like an absorption of ongoing. It's not just policies. It's the media discourse. It's the narratives that then get drawn out there the whole time, and that are echoed the whole time around. Well, they haven't done enough to help themselves. You're in this situation because of the lack of effort, a lack of wanting to make things better, etc. And so many of the policies, I mean, particularly in the UK, are exactly about that, increasing conditionality on access to social benefits that we've seen, over decades now. And then these ideas get picked up in the media. You don't see people that are, have come out of lives of poverty and have done incredibly well and managed to come off benefits. You see whoever the benefit fraudster is. And one of the key things, we wrote a paper a number of years ago around the co-construction of shame in the context of poverty. One of the things that's really important is that through that, ironically, becomes a process of othering. So people want to distance themselves from those people who are fraudsters in the media and in public discourse, who don't do enough. I'm not like them. And that was of such a strong narrative in this work, that the need to distance yourself from that because you really don't want to be associated with it. And so I think it is an internalized, really, really strong internalized process that comes about because of all of these exterior voices and narratives and discourses. So I couldn't agree with you more, Gary, on that.
Thank you. Are there we have time for another perhaps quick question, if there is another question, please. Elaine, did I see your hand up?
Well, I wanted, thanks to everyone. I wondered if Elaine wanted to expand that discussion in relation to COVID, because I think it's been interesting how the narrative of child poverty appears to have shifted a bit away from shame and a bit more towards again, something of some common need of support. But I don't know if you had nuance on that, or whether you think that the same tropes repeat themselves, but in different forms.
I think that's a really good question, Elaine. And I think, I think it was Gemma, wasn't it, that in the first session was talking about this, and how, there are so many people out there that want to do things differently and want to do better. And there's a sense of sort of coming together, and perhaps a greater sensitization in a sense of some of the degrees of how difficult it is for particular families and particular communities. I think what will be really interesting will be to see if we ever reach something post-COVID, or something similar to living with COVID, how much those remain, those concerns, how much they stay, or how much they become embedded, or in some sort of rethinking about a better understanding of people's experiences of poverty. I think that's a really good question.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Gary. There's a comment in the chat from Adisa, who says, interesting presentation, thank you. I see so many parallels with the representational discourses used in othering and shaming practitioners of Al-Marijansi, pronunciation, excuse, in northern Nigeria, where their poverty is used to shame and blame them for their circumstances. So it seems really to be a universal experience, a universally shared feeling with so many negative connotations. If there are no other comments or questions, I would take a break now for 15 minutes and come back at 3:30 for the other two presentations and the plenary. So please, you can, stop your video and come back at 3:30, and we start with our third presentation. Thank you very much to our presenters so far, and to all of you for attending. See you back at 3:30. Thank you.
Can you see that all right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. We're really pleased to be part of these discussions. In our talk today, we're going to be picking up on an issue that's already been mentioned today, which is the free school meals debate within the UK. There we go. So perhaps one of the most compelling stories of the COVID pandemic in the UK has been the debate over free school meals. The issue rose to prominence when well-known footballer Marcus Rashford stepped into the discussion, sharing his personal story of receiving free school meals and calling on the government to address increasing child food poverty, one fallout of the pandemic. Over 1 million people signed his parliamentary petition, and his interventions with the Child Food Poverty Task Force have been widely credited with winning a government U-turn on provision of free school meal support during school holidays for eligible children in England, and a promised rise in Healthy Start vouchers, as well as for helping to expose the paltry food parcels delivered to qualifying children. And you may have all seen this image on the right, which was widely shared on Twitter, of one of these food packages. While Rashford's campaign has captured the public's imagination, grassroots activists, migrants' rights groups, and anti-poverty organizations have been campaigning for the expansion of the free school meals program for years. For instance, groups like NELMA, who both Eve and I were a part of, Project 17, where Eve previously worked, and the Hackney Migrant Centre highlighted the denial of free school meals for some of the most destitute children in the UK. Those children living in families with no recourse to public funds, an immigration conditionality put as a result of being subject to immigration control on both families who are undocumented and those individuals who have some form of restriction in their immigration status. These organizations have called for the universal expansion of free school meals and an end to no recourse to public funds. Children and families with NRPF, so no recourse to public funds, I'll just call it NRPF for now, have been largely excluded from Rashford's campaign, which, echoing the National Food Strategy, calls for free school meals to be expanded to include all families in receipt of universal credit, a form of benefits that families with NRPF are ineligible for, regardless of their level of destitution. Although some families with NRPF have been granted temporary eligibility for free school meals during the pandemic, following the threat of legal challenges in particular, campaigns for access have continued on because of the significant problems with the new temporary policy. So in our paper today, we're going to be drawing on our ongoing research with families who have no recourse to public funds, called Social Reproduction in the Shadows, and on our campaigning experience. And what we will do is consider the recent temporary shifts in free school meal policies, as well as the representational strategies of free school meal advocacy and campaigns that are waged in the name of impoverished children, and think about what they tell us about questions of status, voice, and representation of these same children. We discuss the notions of childhood which ground these policies and campaigns, together with questions about which children are included, excluded, and never possible to include, why and with what effects. To be clear, right from the beginning, our point in this paper is not to critique school meals or more broadly social welfare programs which ensure that everyone has enough to eat, nor to suggest that the organization and groups we were involved in entirely avoided the pitfalls of deservingness that we're going to go on to discuss. In many ways, in fact, this paper represents a process of our own reflection directed towards the practices of groups we've been a part of, as well as those of other campaign organizations. And what we do in this paper is highlight the importance of considering the ways that imaginaries of childhood, poverty, and nation shape policies. And we offer a warning that without reflecting on these imaginaries, campaigns can end up justifying exclusions of marginalized people at the very same time that they aim for more expansive support. Our concerns here are about the limits of particular forms of advocacy, the shrinking frames for articulating social justice claims, and perhaps most urgently, that campaigns for free school meals can end up being a foil for an exclusionary, nativist, and hostile state.
So looking at the main campaign image on Rashford's End Child Poverty website is a helpful and instructive starting point. In this image, what stands out is the exceptionalism of the child. While calling attention to the riches of the UK, and therefore importantly hinting at the wider inequalities which allow hunger to persist, children are specifically singled out as the group for protection. No child should go hungry in this country, goes the quote. Why not say, no one should go hungry? The campaign call works, so to speak, and is legible to the public because it builds on and amplifies a dominant conception of the child as the quintessential deserving subject. While evaluations of deservingness relate to intersecting dimensions and contextual evaluations, it is notable that those perceived to have limited to no control over their circumstances are, in the European context, often those deemed to be the most deserving. We see this call to deservingness echoed in the website statement, which says, whatever your feeling, opinion, or judgment, food poverty is never the child's fault. Here, it is implied that simply because of their youth, children are essentially vulnerable, non-responsible subjects, simply the recipients of adult actions. The use of the term child food poverty, with its focus on a blameless victim beyond the political sphere, does something else. It reifies poverty itself, removing it from larger political questions about the processes of dispossession, extraction, and exploitation, which produce inequality and impoverishment. But the trope of the child works in another way in this call to its exceptionalism. The image features Marcus Rashford prominently, his gaze directing our sights into the distance. We might read this representation as capitalizing on Rashford's celebrity status, where fans' affective attachment to athletic stars can become a key influencer of public thought and action. But we suggest that the representation does something more in the context of the UK's free school meals debate. Rashford represents a wildly successful adult who, as he himself has stated publicly, is where he is because of programmes like free school meals. In a widely covered letter to MPs, Rashford writes, "As a family, we relied on breakfast clubs, free school meals, and the kind actions of neighbours and coaches. Without the kindness and generosity of the community I had around me, there wouldn't be the Marcus Rashford you see today, a 22-year-old black man lucky enough to make a career playing a game I love." Here, Rashford's campaign makes a call to the futures impoverished children can have if we act now. But this call works, so to speak, as part of the campaign, not simply because of Rashford's eloquent and emotive statement. It builds on a long history of representations of childhood as futurity, where the child is constituted as fundamentally malleable, potentially redeemable, and the site for accruing human capital. Rather than deservingness being premised on evaluations of whether support has been earned, as it often is with adults in the sense of, what have you done or can you do for us? Deservingness rests in part on a sense of deferred reciprocity. For example, what the future adult that the child represents has to offer. It is here that the invocation of Rashford's success mobilizes familiar frames for representing childhood, which motivate feelings of deservingness. Finally, we point to the way that childhood exceptionalism is generated in the way that this campaign, like others, constructs a we. We must act with urgency, it says. In this case, although the issue is about child poverty, the we who is addressed are adults. For example, the language makes children and impoverished children the deserving other of adult action. Language such as the child or are young holds children outside the we, rather than also addressing those children and young people who may be experiencing food poverty. Thus, while exceptionalist approaches to childhood put children on a pedestal as the deserving subject par excellence, at the same time, they rarely include them as actors, subjects, and agents in the societies that they live in. Yet, somewhat ironically, children are those who experience the blunt end of free school meals exclusions and the conduits for their inaction. In addition to the detrimental impacts of hunger, children in families with no recourse to public funds who are ineligible for free school meals report being publicly shamed, given debtors' letters by their schools, and told to take them home to mothers who are being charged hundreds of pounds for school meals they cannot afford. They have been threatened with missing important school activities, and some have been subject to discriminatory abuse and taunting from other children as a result of the public display of debt. We also know that far from being unknowing bystanders or recipients, many children are highly aware of the state policies and institutional practices which shape the conditions of their lives, including the impact of exclusionary free school meal policies. As one young person involved in Nelma's campaign for free school meals put it, "Each time I was having the school meals, they were putting debt on my mum. Keep adding debt what she needs to pay. And by the time you know it, they had her in thousands of pounds of debt. The last one I saw was £120. Me and my mum, we were really scared because we were so worried. How is my mum going to pay this money? We didn't have anything then. We were just living our lives." His comments highlight a further problem with the invocation of child exceptionalism, the splintering of children and their carers. We hinted at this previously when we asked rhetorically, why not say no one should go hungry? One of the issues with campaigns invoking essentialized views of deservingness, such as food poverty is never the child's fault, is that it implies it is someone else's fault. In the context of a heavily familialized welfare regime, where parents are increasingly held individually responsible for their child's every success or failure, and a hostile migration regime where migrants, particularly those who are undocumented, are read as the least deserving, behind the statement is an implicit message that adult food poverty may at least be partly the fault of the adult, underpinned by assumptions that perhaps they should be working or working harder, that food poverty is somehow in their control in a manner that it isn't for children. You likely felt the statement adult food poverty to ring strangely for this reason. It certainly does not map easily onto discourses of deservingness. Yet, as Linda Gordon argues, child exceptionalism rarely generates much material help for children, and it certainly justifies decreasing support for parents who are rendered undeserving. As the lives of children and adults are deeply entangled, and children's legal and cultural positioning produces relations of social dependence, ultimately child exceptionalism fails to deliver on its promises for children and is very easily undercut. Without taking into account the context of children's lives and those with whom they live them, any solidarity and support will only ever be partial at best.
Perhaps the greatest irony, even violence, of approaches which galvanize child exceptionalism is the fact that some children are unchilded, to borrow Nadira Shalabab Kevorkian's evocative term. We use the concept of unchilding here to highlight those who are effectively denied inclusion as children in campaigns based on child exceptionalism. Children and families with NRPF are amongst some of the most destitute families in the UK, yet they have historically been invisible or had limited representation in most free school meals campaigns. Some of these families are denied the right to work. Others cannot work because they have limited to childcare for young children. And those who can work are often in low-paid, precarious positions. Families with NRPF are ineligible for most welfare benefits, such as universal credit, and do not qualify for social housing. At the same time, they face exorbitant costs to regularize or maintain their leave to remain, their immigration status. In the absence of formal access to welfare provision, destitute families with NRPF may be supported with accommodation and low-level financial support. However, the number of destitute families is, and an estimated 5,900 children received such support in 2012 to 2013. However, the number is probably much higher. A number of destitute families is much higher. Many families who try to access this support are erroneously turned away. Some are told by social workers to use their credit cards or on hotels before accommodation will be provided. Others are subject to invasive and discriminatory treatment. For example, Facebook pages and bank statements are trolled for income generation that has not been reported. Determinations of deservingness required by the legislation are often characterized by extreme suspicion, and particularly around racialized conceptions of who deserves support, which we'll go on to discuss further. One family in our research, a mother and 3 teenage sons, had been sleeping in a single room for over 7 years. Other families who participated in our study described being trapped in abusive relationships, not having enough food to eat, and experiencing hyper-exploitation and under-the-table work, as well as street homelessness. Some families, as described by the young person quoted above, wind up in deep debt to cover the basic costs of living, high immigration fees, such as the one shown in the slide here, and even to pay for school meals. Often families find themselves forced to choose between incurring debt or their child going hungry. Despite the conditions of NRPF, which enforce destitution and debt, the most widely supported campaign for widening free school meal access, Rashford's, continues to be linked to families in receipt of universal credit. And as we said, historically, this has been the case for many mainstream children's charities. Although during the pandemic, these charities did broaden their calls to include children who had been previously excluded, especially after the threat of legal action won a short-term policy shift, making some children in families with NRPF temporarily eligible for free school meals. Although there have been some misrepresentations or misunderstandings of who is actually included in these policy extensions. For example, CPEG has importantly begun supporting the call for children and families with NRPF to be eligible. They claim that the government extended free school meals to include families with no recourse to public funds, mistakenly implies that all families were made eligible. In fact, the temporary extension only applies to a subsection of families and continues to exclude undocumented families who are not in receipt of statutory support and who are therefore likely to be experiencing the most extreme forms of destitution. School canteens, when schools are open, and school vouchers continue to be spaces of welfare exclusion. And some children continue to be excluded from the category of child, which grounds campaigns based on child exceptionalism. They simply aren't visible and aren't included. We might view the exclusion of some children from these campaigns as an easy to make mistake or a simplification of a complex policy terrain for campaigns intended to win broad support, public support. But either seem like thin explanations, particularly when we are talking about organizations with extensive and detailed knowledge of free school meals policies. For example, in a recent letter to the Prime Minister, Rashford and his task force specifically referenced children with NRPF. They call on the Prime Minister to launch a review of free school meals policies, stating that the ongoing eligibility for children with no recourse to public funds should be addressed explicitly. But what, if anything, is actually being called for with respect to children with NRPF? There's no mention of the exclusion of many and not a call to make this temporary expansion permanent. The National Food Strategy recommendations referred to focus on expanded eligibility for families in receipt of universal credit and exclude those with NRPF. In our conversations with both charities and lawyers involved in campaigns for free school meals, we've found some suggestive comments here. They suggest that the exclusion of families with NRPF from these campaigns is premised on ideas about winnability, a sort of something rather than nothing approach. Taking the legal challenges for expanding free school meals as an example, decisions were made as to who would make more deserving clients, and therefore who would be most compelling in the effort at policy change. At the same time, arguments were premised at least partially on the COVID-19 pandemic. As such, the policy change that resulted reflected these constraints. It was both temporary, tied to the pandemic, and only for those few groups for whom legal claims were made. We make this point not to criticize the lawyers who advocated on behalf of the families, who are only working within the parameters of an unjust legal system, but to highlight some of the limitations of legal and other forms of advocacy. Prior to the legal challenge around eligibility for free school meals, some charities said that they were concerned to make undocumented children or those with NRPF visible in free school meals campaigns, but to do so would garner little public support. Other campaigns and legal challenges operate under similar assumptions. Arguments for, quote, British children affected by NRPF and those legally residing predominate. At stake here is the question of deservingness and the possibility that Karen Dubinsky talks about when children are represented in political campaigns. That is, she says, quote, the child explains very little, but at the same time, they can move emotional and psychic mountains. What the campaigns and advocacy suggest, however, is that not just any child figure will do in this logic. Some may not move mountains, but may sediment them. In other words, some young people are not read as child, the deserving subject. They are unchildhood in the sense that they are not included as representatives of child exceptionalism. Out of concerns, they will be potentially read as undeserving migrants. Such ideas about deservingness are grounded on long-standing colonial, nativist, and sedentarist ideas. Many families with NRPF who experience destitution come from countries colonized as part of Britain's empire. It is impossible to determine precisely how many, but Jamaicans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Pakistanis are among the higher numbers of those with families with NRPF who have been able to get support through the Children's Act. And notably here, Britain used its 1981 Nationality Act to limit or deny negatively racialized Commonwealth citizens, upon whom its wealth and welfare system was built, access to legal routes to residence and citizenship, leaving largely irregular routes available. But not only does the UK's affluence, the 5th richest country in the world, as Rashford's campaign reminds us, derive from colonial plunder, but the UK's wealth and welfare state continues to be funded by austerity, extraction, and tax evasions in what Paul Gilbert calls Britain's Second Empire. Yet this appropriation is hidden, he argues, by the technical language of development and good governance. Together, we suggest these factors produce ideas about Black and brown migrants as outsiders to the UK's community of value, in Bridget Anderson's words, and therefore undeserving drains on its welfare system, rather than sources and producers of its spoils. What we are suggesting then is that advocates make decisions about how to best represent their causes to create what they consider to be the most compelling cases, and that these decisions are often based on historical and contemporary discourses of deservingness. These representational decisions have considerable effects. Taking free school meals as an example, what exactly is won in these campaigns based on child exceptionalism? On the one hand, in the last year, we can see a significant shift in free school meals policy as campaigns have made visible long-standing needs which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this has resulted in greater access to free school meals. However, there remain grave problems with the temporary extension, and not least that it is only temporary and excludes undocumented families. It is particularly problematic that the free school meals eligibility has been tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Home Office claims that the temporary extension was put in place in recognition of the difficulties that they may be facing during these unique circumstances. The statement firmly locates the need for free school meals within the context of COVID-19, and in doing so, it obscures the long-standing hunger and homelessness experienced by families with NRPF. Further, and particularly important in the context of this paper, by focusing on the impact of the pandemic and erasing undocumented families for the sake of winnable demands, many campaigns inadvertently reproduce exclusions. In other words, campaigns do not simply respond to public narratives of deservingness, but they play a central role in shaping them. Consequently, changes do not necessarily help those who are most destitute. A logic of partial inclusion is maintained and reinforced, and one that is to date temporary at best. Yet these approaches are not inevitable or unchanging. Since the COVID-19 extension, larger children's charities have begun including families with NRPF in their advocacy, especially in terms of calling for the extension to be made permanent, albeit that these exclusions are rarely, if ever, covered in media coverage.
As we said at the beginning of the talk, our goal in this paper has not been to condemn free school meals or those who campaign for their expansion, quite the opposite. We are, however, arguing that the ways that campaigns represent their causes, in this case through the exceptionalism of childhood, unchilding, and a focus on the extraordinary circumstances of COVID, has an impact beyond the simple question of winning or losing specific policy changes. And these more extended impacts, we suggest, have no less long-term relevance than a policy shift, and perhaps more. As we have attempted to demonstrate in relation to free school meals, advocates can end up reproducing long-standing exclusions in efforts to build winnable campaigns. But more, they can wind up narrowing the frame of political discussion to technical questions about who is deserving. This accepts the unequal grounds on which representations of impoverished children are read and responded. For example, the logic of colonial welfare systems and neoliberal migration regimes, which make no recourse to public funds, seem acceptable, and poverty to be a thing rather than a process whereby some people are impoverished and others profit. Narrow views of winning foreclose the possibility of deliberating more radical arguments and alternatives. There is then a need for a shift, not just in free school meals policy, but also in advocacy, towards historicized, systemic, and inclusive accounts, including all children as co-constructors of this knowledge, of both the causes and effects of demands made in the name of social and economic justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Eve, for this rich and provocative, at least for me, presentation. We have a question from Anne Leverton. Anne, would you like to raise your question, and then perhaps I'll go back to some of my own issues. Anne? You unmuted? No, there isn't. The hand has been withdrawn. Okay, sorry. No need to apologize. So we've got a question from Judith. Judith, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. I thought this was a really excellent presentation. It raised all sorts of sort of normative questions for me, going back to where we started, which is that there's obviously a political and a conceptual connection between poverty and justice, as Anka pointed out. And I'd like to ask a question, but this is also partly about Elaine's presentation. So I thought what came out really well in your talk, Rachel and Eve, was how the political imaginaries that kind of inform our understanding of justice and so on are obscured sometimes by these superficial kind of emotive appeals to questions about child poverty. And to me, this connects with something that Elaine mentioned in her talk, which is the worry that the sort of individualizing the sort of shame and other aspects of the poverty experience of the child, that's a problem, right? That's a problem for the child's concern, and we need to kind of move away from sort of relational ways in which poor children are positioned that individualizes their own sort of experience of poverty, move away from the sort of discourses of shame. But is there not a tension here in that, in trying to ensure that individual children who experience poverty are not shamed and are not stigmatized in the kind of ways that Elaine is talking about? Are we not also then in danger of normalizing poverty as something that has to be just accepted, that, it's giving a message that it's okay to be poor, which in itself, I think, also sort of depoliticizes it. I'm sorry if this is really confusing. I'm just kind of thinking it through. It seems to me that there's a worry that the sort of attempt to do away with discourses of shame leads to a kind of emphasis on inclusion and equality, in the sense that, it's fine to be poor, there's no shame in being poor, rather than a narrative of justice, which is, to me, the main issue that comes out of Rachel and Eve's talk. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. Sorry, it feels a bit muddled.
Shall I come back quickly on that? I think that's absolutely right, Judith. I mean, the question is, do we just want people to carry on living in poverty, but do so in dignity? No, I think is the answer to that. That's absolutely right. And that free school meals, the proliferation of food banks, etc., have become completely normalized within this. So I think absolutely not. We have but at the same time, we have a policy menu, I suppose, that needs to respond to people's lived realities now. But there's a much bigger agenda which needs to be addressed. And so certainly a lot of the work around shame has been reversed, if you like, for the focus on dignity, so dignity enhancing, which then becomes a human right, and it's fundamentally pinned then to a body and a discourse about rights. And I think that's absolutely where it should be. So that would be my sort of reflections on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Rachel and Eve, would you like to come back to this perhaps quickly? And then I've got a further question, and then we move on to the next presentation. Yes. Rachel, Eve.
I mean, just briefly to say, I think that's absolutely right, Judith. I mean, in our own research, we are hearing about experiences of shame. But I think one of the arguments we're trying to make with this paper is that while recognizing the problematics and that impoverishment, process of impoverishment, have affect, emotional effects on people, that shouldn't be the limits of our political imaginations and the conversations we have about why this is happening and what might be done to change it. And so we speak very specifically, or we're thinking very specifically about understanding poverty not as a thing, but as a process, that there are causes for impoverishment, for thinking about what those causes are, for thinking about, for example, in this case, about the colonial welfare system in the UK, which does unchild certain children, write certain children out, and that needs to be part of the ways in which we discuss these kinds of questions, not politically neutering them through the call to the child.
Thank you. And indeed, there are also considerations relating to what are the goods of childhood, as we heard at the very beginning, and how is this process of co-creation in the narratives of poverty, perhaps overlooking that children might have some special status, and how this intersects with, what they're living when they are in poverty. But we may want to leave this for later on. Adisa, you had your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question now or to postpone it to the plenary?
I could wait if we're short of time. I'm happy to wait.
No, if it is relevant and to the point, we can take it now, and then we'll extend the time for the last presentation. Adisa, please proceed.
Just a quick question. I'm a post-colonial scholar, and I'm listening to talks about unchilding. Fascinating conversations all around, actually. And I'm thinking, how much is it linked to I'm forming a new word now, the unhumaning of others? That deep, because you're talking about exceptionalism, and I'm thinking there must be a link here between just general exceptionalism. We're special. If children are starving somewhere, that's fine, but our children cannot starve. I was deeply fascinated by how hidden in the open these things are. No one knows that these other children are not getting free school meals. That has come as a surprise to me and as a shock. But I'm linking it to refugees and people who do not have the status, and most predominantly maybe brown bodies, and how they are often seen as less. So you're talking about colonial legacies, and I'm thinking about the imaginaries, the limitations. A lot of people do not know this. If you live in Britain, there are so many foreclosures in terms of the realities, the fashioning of or the way that we're conditioned to know. So I suppose my question is, how much is this unchilding and exceptionalism linked to just the general attitude and superiority of Western ways of existing and beings? And I don't know if that has come out, but no, thank you. It's brilliant.
Rachel or Eve, would you like to respond to this? Briefly, and we might pick it up later on.
Sorry, we're chatting about who's going to respond to it. It's a really important point, I think, Adisa. Thank you so much. And I think to pull together a brief comment, I think you're right around those sort of questions around visibility and invisibility. And so part of, I think, the way that the kind of colonial welfare state functions is it becomes part of the ongoing imaginary that this somehow is, these are the goods of British people, and that the formation of the British welfare state becomes assumed as a national project, when, as you've pointed out, it's formed within a colonial project, a project of empire, and continues to be funded in that way. But that's outside the conversation, and it becomes a way, I think, of justifying the exclusions of certain people and the invisibility of certain people within who is deserving, allowable, and even visible, and for the goods of the welfare state. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel and Eve, for yet another brilliant presentation in our seminar. If it's okay with everybody, I would go on to our fourth and last presentation for the day, allowing Jenny to have her 10 minutes past the 4:30 and then go into the plenary. So I'm absolutely again, delighted to introduce Jenny Parks, who is Professor of Education, Gender and International Development at UCL Institute of Education. Lots of people from UCL Institute of Education today, but that's very good. And Jenny's research focuses on the relationship between violence, gender and inequalities in young people's lives, and the role of education, with research studies in South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Uganda, as well as the UK. Her recent research into school-related gender-based violence prevention and response includes innovative partnerships with UN agencies, governments, and NGOs. Jenny is the editor of Gender Violence in Poverty Context and has published widely on issues including school-related gender-based violence, poverty, and inequality in education. Today, Jenny is presenting a paper entitled Teenage Pregnancy in the COVID Lockdown in Uganda, Representation, Voice, and Silence. Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Lorella, and I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I think before I start, I just want to acknowledge the work of the qualitative research team who've been part of the broader project that I'm going to be talking about some of the time in this presentation. Simona Datsberger, Joanne Kasidi, Rehema Nagawa, and Brian Musenze. And Simona is here as well, so I hope we'll be able to join me in the questions at the end. What I'm aiming to do here is to consider questions of representation, status, and voice in relation to poverty, education, and childhood through reflecting on teenage pregnancy during the COVID pandemic. And why I chose to focus on teenage pregnancy here was because it seems from our research to be, which is an ongoing project, at the nexus of themes of childhood, poverty, and education. It often seems to kind of mark in quite an abrupt way the end of childhood and also of schooling. And then with COVID, there are widespread reports in low-income countries, particularly in Africa, of rises in teenage pregnancy during school closures, although it's quite anecdotal at the moment. Oh, hang on, I'm just going to go back. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of our work with young people themselves, young people who've been participating in a longitudinal study in Uganda. And I'm going to be thinking about them in relation to a number of questions. How in the current crisis teenage pregnancy is represented in policy and media, how is it spoken about by young people themselves who are experiencing pregnancy, with what notions of gender, childhood and schooling, how do they come into play, and with what effects on children's lives. So there's kind of some of the things that I've been thinking about when preparing this. I just wanted to start with an interesting paper. It's interesting, we already had a reference to Young Lives. This is a particular paper from their longitudinal qualitative research in Uganda, which they call Motherhood in Childhood. And they point out how social changes have involved marriage and motherhood, this is particularly in Uganda, in past generations, it was a norm for that to be taking place in childhood, but increasingly it's seen as incompatible with modern female childhood, and the kind of discourse of empowerment is associated with a shift in normative ideas and a changing gender script for young women. So there's a mapping of a normative trajectory from childhood schooling to adult employment, followed by marriage and motherhood. So there's kind of shift in sequencing. Schooling, and there's lots of studies on this, but schooling is often frequently viewed as a way out of poverty. This is also something that's come up in previous parts of the seminar series. Schooling being viewed as a way out of poverty and a route to a better life. But for in the Young Lives study, they found that many young women weren't able to achieve this. There's a kind of, they use the term ambiguous agency to reflect on the way that young women had to contend contradictions of discourse and the realities of marriage and motherhood. So some of these themes from their work are very much echoed in the context of Uganda, a different country, different context, but with some common themes, particularly around schooling, this kind of schooling being seen as a way out of poverty and a route to a better life, and changing patterns, changing social change happening. What we also see is this a kind of strong notion that as there's the legal age of consent is 18 years, so below the age of 18, sex is prohibited, and there's a strong discourse around girlhood chastity, but there's also studies that have looked at how boys, the norms around boys being expected to be sexually active and girls as restrained. And we also, the latest demographic health survey in 2016 found that although there have been changes, still 25% of 15 to 19-year-olds at that time have begun childbearing. So there's a kind of disconnect between this notion of abstinence, notion of schooling being in a sense a form of contraception. You don't have sex while you're in school, and yet, teenagers have sex. So it kind of made me think about that in the first presentation, and talking about free sort of sexual innocence. Saying something somewhat different here. In relation to pandemics and epidemics, in 2014-15, the Ebola crisis, there was, and particularly studies in Sierra Leone identified increases in teenage pregnancy in many communities, how girls faced, who were pregnant, faced stigma and discrimination, and how that was reinforced in particular by the Ministry of Education's ban on re-entry to schools or to their local schools. And there was an interesting paper by Miner, who looked at, it's very critical, and has echoes of what we just heard from Rachel and Eve, echoes of this kind of tendency not to look at the kind of global and national and local structures behind social issues. So their critique was the tendency to blame local sociocultural norms and values, and in particular, blaming girls for kind of being negligent or bored and getting pregnant, or often pregnancy being seen as a product of violence, so men being viewed as perpetrators, rather than thinking about the global, national, local structures of impoverishment that lead girls, or led girls as hopes of schools faded, to look for romantic relationships with financial assistance. And we've seen some echoes of this in our work. This is just to give a few, I'm going to give a few examples, but the Ministry of Education guidelines on prevention and management of teenage pregnancy in school settings in Uganda, which came out in November 2020, so very much coming out in the time of COVID. supports re-entry. It starts with this preface from the First Lady and Minister of Education and Sports. Don't read out the whole thing, but we can see echoes there of the kind of blaming of the socio-cultural norms and the kind of, again, it links a little with some of the others, but you know, we can blame the abuse of children, poor parenting styles, lack of life skills, negative social and cultural norms as being the kind of causes of pregnancy. The policy itself supports re-entry to schools, and I want to acknowledge that because that's not true in a number of countries, including Tanzania next door. You know, so there is a sense that there is a government articulation of re-entry to schools. And also recently that there was a presidential announcement that pregnant schoolgirls should have 45 minutes extra time in public examinations. I'm not sure why, but anyway, but there's a kind of notion that something needs to happen to support pregnant schoolgirls in relation to their education. There are also some really concerning things to me in the report, particularly the idea that you should have pregnancy testing, mandatory pregnancy testing for all girls in secondary schools, at least termly. And I was thinking about the kind of the points people have been making about shame, about respect. I mean, what kind of around rights violations, around forcing girls to have pregnancy tests. There's also a requirement that girls go on leave from schools from 3 months pregnant till birth, and boys actually, the boys to their partners, and for girls only for 6 months after the birth. So there are kind of questions about, well, how realistic is it that young people are going to come back to school, young women are going to come back to school after a whole year out of school? So there are some kind of questions around the way the policy is focused. The media there have been a lot of examples in the media of references to pregnancy since the lockdown. And so quite a lot of media coverage, I think, influenced very much by the NGOs working in the field. The stress has often been on kind of giving numbers, giving figures of teenage pregnancies. So kind of panic around the numbers of girls who are pregnant, although none of them seem to have any comparison with figures before the pandemic. It's difficult to know what's going on. But we see these kind of constructions of girls as victims of abuse, of poor parenting, of peer pressure, of sometimes poverty. So it's kind of echoing other the papers around the vulnerability of girls, and sometimes also as being kind of blamed for they got pregnant out of idleness, or we see at the bottom there's redundant time for learners. They should be studying what they're doing there, getting up to sex. And there's almost no mention of boys. Occasionally men as perpetrators luring, but the boys are sort of out of the picture altogether. In the representations as well, there's quite a stress in terms of the kinds of interventions on the need for a school health policy, provision of sexual and reproductive health curriculum during school closures, having accessible SRH services. Those are the kinds of interventions, and I'll come back to that later, that are being kind of sort of advocated for in the articles. Just very quickly on our study, it's part of a bigger project on context of violence and adolescent cohort study that we're doing with a mixture of partner organisations in Uganda and in the UK. And the qualitative component that our team has been focused on has been over the last few years developing longitudinal biographical narratives with 36 young people who are core participants, who between roughly the age of 16 and 19 years, originally coming from Luwera district, which is an area in central Uganda. They live in different kinds of peri-urban, rural, and sometimes urban settings. The predominant work in Luero is subsistence farming, but also a range of informal and more formal forms of employment. And then since the pandemic, we've had two sets of data collection. Firstly, phone interviews to get while there was a full lockdown in Uganda in May 2020, and then as things eased, the research team went and carried out face-to-face interviews with the same young people. So that's helped to illuminate the significance of the COVID crisis in their everyday lives. There's been very stringent lockdown in Uganda. Schools since March, schools were closed, businesses were closed, public gatherings banned, travel restrictions, nighttime curfews. Gradually, those have been eased, except schools are still only open for what they call candidate classes, so the year groups are going to do public examination, and more recently, a couple of other year groups. So it's kind of gradually opening up of schools. Most other things are open now. What we found in our phone survey, sorry, not phone, it wasn't a survey, our phone interviews, was that COVID was clearly amplifying inequalities, that young people, most of the young people were concerned about the loss of livelihoods, themselves and their families, their loss of education, access to basic foodstuffs, and the effects were most marked among those who were already disadvantaged prior to the pandemic. By October, when the research team visited and spoke in person to the young people, many of the young people and some of the teachers spoke of girls in their communities who got pregnant during the lockdown. And a few of the young people we've been working with are now pregnant, or their partners are pregnant. So we've been speaking with them. What I want to do is to just talk about one or share some of the data from interview conversation that Joanne, our researcher, Joanne Cassidy, has been having with Bukake. Joanne's been the key researcher for her since the beginning of the project, so they know each other very well now. And so I kind of want to just acknowledge her, how important she's been in this discussion. I've got just 3 slides showing little extracts. I'm not going to read the extracts themselves, so I hope you can sort of read and listen at the same time. Just to give you a bit of background on Mukake, she's 16. She's the firstborn child living with both her parents, and her father is a butcher. Her mother does subsistence farming and also works in a retail shop. They, in a sense, were more fortunate than many of the other young people in that their parents still managed to earn some of a living during the lockdown, but they're with quite a much reduced income. She's in senior 4, or she was in senior 4 until the schools closed, which is it's the equivalent of in the UK GCSE year. So she was due to take public examination, and her family have a history of struggling to pay school fees. So we heard already from Elaine about Uganda and having a policy of universal secondary education. But the reality for all the young people, all the schools, not just the, not just fee-paying schools, but all the schools in our study, is that there are all sorts of kind of costs of schooling. I was going to say hidden costs, but they're not even very hidden. So, and that make it very, very difficult for families to keep sending their daughters and sons to school. And for this family, it's been a struggle that's come up in discussions over the years for them to continue to support her schooling. But until the lockdown, they had managed to do that. She's got a boyfriend who's 19 years old and earns an income sort of low income from odd jobs, and also from being a boda driver. So she's that's a kind of taxi motorbike. But she's kept that quiet, so people didn't know about the boyfriend until recently. His extracts or her how she described how she got pregnant, and I included them because I wanted to compare the way she speaks about why she got pregnant and what we saw from the news articles and the different ways in which girls are represented in policy and media. And what we see here is a kind of mix of reasons in her story. Importantly, she situates pregnancy within this kind of normative context of boys being more able than girls to find work and of female dependency. Men and boys expected to be providers, and with these economic shocks to families, girls face increasing dependency on their boyfriends. And this is something we've heard again and again through the study. When she talks about her own experience, her pregnancy was unintended and unwanted, but not coerced. And so repeatedly talked about pregnancy as always coming from abuse. It's kind of important that this was from a consent, to me, that this is from a consensual relationship. She describes it as curiosity, maybe carelessness. So there's kind of sense of self-blame in there. But also we see how her contraceptive knowledge seems to be based on kind of hearsay. So there's a kind of mixture of her blaming herself, but also these kind of normative and material constraints that have been exacerbated by COVID. So what happened when she spoke out about the pregnancy? As I said, there was kind of initial secrecy around the boyfriend, and when she did speak out to her at home, her father was furious, very disappointed, angry, and he throws her out. He forces her that she needs to go and move to the boyfriend and his family. Her mother was distressed, but very supportive of her, and she told the researcher that she wasn't happy with the father's position. So there's differences. So I think it's really important, this kind of challenging of the blaming of families, that actually families are spaces of contestation. You can see that already here. Also here in the threats of the father of imprisoning is a reminder that the law in Uganda criminalizes the 19-year-old boyfriend, and that her dependency it shifts from her own from her being in her own birth family to her boyfriend and his family, but she's still dependent. She has no choice in who will take care or take responsibility for her. And then when she's talking about her education, her father refuses to pay any more schooling costs. There's a teacher here who seems to be supportive, who tries to speak to the father, but even after that intervention, he's not going to change his mind. The responsibility, in his view, shifts to the family that she's moving into. And then she asks the boyfriend whether he would pay for her school fees, because it's really important to her to actually go and do these public examinations. It gives her the next level of qualification. And he says he loves her, but there's no money. He doesn't have enough money for her to pay her school fees. Maybe next year. It's kind of pushed off into the distance. And then there's a kind of negotiation between the families, which her mother is kind of important in brokering, which ends up with a kind of written commitment from the boyfriend, probably because of the legal situation in part, but to pay the fees so that she can at least do her exams. So she is going to, at least in the very short term, be able to go back to school, but her distress around pregnancy seems to be related to this kind of the future possibilities for her. And or partly and largely. Joanne asked, has getting pregnant caused any changes in your dreams? And I had to reduce this, but yes, the answer. And she's saying now that, her intention had been that she would go as far as she could in school, then work for 1 or 2 years, and then go back to school with being able to support her own schooling. But she's aware that that won't happen now. She has new responsibilities associated with no longer child status in her new household and motherhood, and along with her boyfriend's kind of relatively low income. So she's kind of having to shrink her expectations. There's this abrupt shift for her from childhood, and she's still got kind of making an effort to retain some schoolgirl positionality, but her voice carries little weight. So just to wrap up, in conclusion, rapid social change has shifted norms in Uganda around girlhood, marriage, motherhood, and education. But teenage pregnancies remain commonplace across Africa, and as we've seen in Uganda, and appear to be rising since COVID. Representations in policy and media of pregnant girls are kind of contradictorily constructing them as victims and vulnerable, and also to blame, that they seem to all be happening at the same time. Maybe listening to the earlier discussions and questions, maybe there is a shifting of the narrative during COVID a little more towards the kind of recognizing the vulnerability and the kind of need to support, but it's particular kinds of support. And I think there's an emphasis on, school and sexual and reproductive health services, so get kind of access and knowledge. But and I think this echoes Rachel and Eve's presentation. What much more attention is needed to this kind of structural and systemic failures to redress poverty for young people and their families, including kind of the labour market, the way that the labour markets disadvantage the poor, these kind of hidden, not so hidden costs of schooling, and the huge economic burdens from the COVID lockdown, and those kind of really creating the conditions for pregnancy, or these kind of unwanted pregnancies. Alongside these normative discourses kind of operating at all levels of society around gender and childhood, that end up blaming, shaming and silencing pregnant girls in particular, and also their boyfriends. Thank you. References.
Lorelli, you're muted.
Myself. Okay, is it better now? Sorry, I had unmuted myself, but my new laptop has a life of its own. It's very much agentic. I was just thanking Jenny for another insightful and very vivid presentation about how the effects of poverty intersect with gender and with other elements, but how some recurring elements are there. So, for example, the shifting away of attention from structural issues to a more individualized or the blaming and shaming of some groups of people, and how this seems to be quite universal insofar as we've seen presentations today. And also this persistent view of the individual failure, as it were, to not fail themselves, rather than looking at the context in which these children are raised and operating. But I would like now to open to the audience for some questions directly to Jenny, and then we move on to our plenary. So are there questions? I see a comment in the chat by Gary. Just a thought, one for plenary, or perhaps. We wonder if universal basic income and or universal services is a potential part of the solution, and indeed whether it would help to neutralize the post-colonial political imaginaries too, or whether the issue with undocumented family would remain the case even with the universal basic income approach. This is more relating perhaps to the previous presentation, and we might take it further in the plenary. But I wonder whether there are other questions that are more directed at Jenny's concerns in relation to girls, their positions in realities like Uganda, and how this has repercussions in their own lives, because we are talking here obviously about lives. Elaine Unterhalter, we've got different Elaines.
Thanks, Lorella, and thanks, Jenny. That was really, really interesting. I'm wondering whether there's something, well, maybe the contours of this discourse of blame and displaced identification of poverty and its causes, whether, while that might be the same, and we've seen it across the three papers that have used empirical data, and I think there's going to be a question to come back to Anka in relation to her issues about childhood later, but whether there's also something specific about girls, so that in the kind of discourse around anxieties around pregnancy, around the explanatory force and the political significance invested in girls, everything is shifted to social norms and institutions. That's where gender inequality lies. And the ways in which poverty is associated with, I think, increased levels of unwanted pregnancy, lack of access to sexual and reproductive health, lack of good quality schooling, all of that is never talked about. So that there's something about gender that invites you to talk about gender inequitable norms in a way that it's silenced in relation to talking about race. It's silenced in relation to talking about the exclusions of the welfare state, although that the thing of benefit families on benefit and the undeserving poor is probably a version of it. But yeah, I just wondered if there was something about the discourse of girls and poverty, girls and pregnancy, and I think it might be FGM as well, that all become linked together and displace there's no discussion of poverty in that Ugandan ministry document. Poverty is just not talked about, is it?
No, Simona, do come off mute, because I'm sure Simona will have something to say to these questions as well. And it would be great to have you speak to, Simona. But yeah, while you're thinking about that, that's really interesting. I think part of the way that pregnancy is seen has been dominated by a kind of public health lens. And then also there's this kind of tendency to, and I'm wary about saying this because I work on violence, and so I think we should be talking about violence, but there can be also this kind of sense around gender that it very quickly goes to abuse, and so it sort of bypasses. So it goes kind of straight to this notion of vulnerable girlhood and sort of bypasses those other areas, those other avenues. So even if you do talk about poverty, it's kind of seen as kind of forcing these vulnerable girls to act in, it moves to the girl very, very quickly. So I think the kind of the political, economic, social history, the kind of all those other layers do get kind of squeezed out. I would agree, Elaine. Simona, do you want to come in at all?
Oh, everyone, yeah. I think just like the presentation in general, also like Elaine's question, sorry, I'd also turn on my camera here. Hello, everyone. It actually really made me also think about the debates that were happening a few years ago about the girl effect. I'm not sure whether you remember then, and Jason Hickel has been writing about this, and I forgot her first name, but I think it was Fatima Shane, or Fasana Shane, sorry, on the girl effect. And I think this is exactly also sort of like happening right now when we think about pregnancy and poverty, and now adding COVID-19 to that aspects of structural violence, and then really in a wider sense, also this global structural violence and how that leads to local structural violence, and then how this affects these families. And then the daughters of these families in the end is often really missed out. And I really liked Elaine Chase's PowerPoint slide where you, Elaine, showed these little boxes about shame. And I think it would be very interesting to sort of like have these sort of like boxes seeing how structural violence from the global to the local interlinks at the family member level basically, and then how this affects these girls' life paths. And obviously it's not just structural violence, but it does really play a very important role in all of this. I think that's my very short 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, what I was trying to do is to kind of bring together the discursive and the material. And I think sometimes we get caught down one or the other a bit. And it just seems to me that they're so woven in together that that's really important. That's why I see another couple of things coming in the chat here. And religion, Tammy's making the point about religion, which I haven't talked about at all, but you know, we could do a whole paper on, you know, religion, on colonial influences, how those affect. There's all the work around sexual and reproductive health and other areas. And then there's a question from Judith around the legality of abortion. I believe it is legal, abortion, but I don't know the details of that. I don't know if Simona knows more, but we also know that actually there's some horrific sort of accounts in our data of people conducting their own abortions, girls locking themselves away to do that. So it's, you know, how much that's to do with the secrecy, how much that's to do with the fear of being found. So you kind of, I think it's that as much, and also potential costs of, you know, getting to a medical centre or the kind of treatment you might need to pay for, rather than the legality.
The stigma and shame around it, coming back to also, yeah, what Elaine's presentation, there's a lot of shame around getting an abortion as well. So it's often done in secret and in very dangerous settings. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Simone, for your engagement with these important questions and for opening up now to our plenary very nicely, because all the issues that you have highlighted obviously linked to what has been said in the chat and to all the elements that we have discussed or started to discuss in relation to previous presentations. So if it's okay, I would like to go back to this question or this suggestion by Gary about universal basic income. Obviously in where these have been proposed and where these are actually considered, but also more generally as a possible solution or a possible way of addressing these concerns, both in terms of material deprivation, but also in terms of the respect due to everyone, and therefore whether universal basic income could actually neutralize some of the concerns and some of the issues that we see repeated, like who is included and who is excluded in terms of access to benefits, who is deserving, who is not deserving, the hierarchy in jobs and social statuses relating to jobs and so on, that produces those hierarchy that leads to inequalities and so on. So I would like to perhaps call on Rachel and Eve, if they don't mind me, to start this, and then go back maybe to Elaine Chase in order to see whether you have some insights on this particular issue, and also Anka, if she is considering this, and also in relation to particular status of childhood and children, that is so much being questioned by the first further presentation. So here a little bit of a mixed approach. Rachel and Eve, would you like to start us on this?
Yeah, I can start us off.
That's great.
So, I mean, my initial thought is that one of the problems with universal provision is sometimes it's not actually universal. And I think there are all sorts of issues with, access. So I think, the extent to which undocumented people would want to be registered on a system, and all the kind of issues with trust that for good reason people want to kind of lay low. So I think for me, it has limited kind of potential within this domain without a kind of radical overhaul of the migration regime. But I would also say that there can be some good effects with universal provision, which are maybe less than what we need, but something. So for instance, free school meals between reception and year 2 are universal. And I know that many of the families in our research really value that provision. So I guess it can do something, but I think it's possibly limited in the way that, for instance, we see, primary healthcare as universal. Everybody should be able to access GPs, but in reality, like many undocumented people cannot because they don't have, ID, and there's lots of kind of gatekeeping around that. So I think, it often, in terms of implementation, it's not as universal as it might be in theory.
Thanks, Eve. Thanks very much. Who would like to? Elaine Chase. Elaine, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
Not really. I think Eve has talked a lot, really clearly about it's not just about the policy, it's how it's structured and designed and delivered. And those elements like registration, non-registration, who can register, what if you're undocumented, all of those issues, those hidden sides of universality, I think are really important to engage with. So I think those are really, really good points.
Thank you, Elaine. And obviously it leads to notions of citizenship. So who is considered to be a citizen with a legitimate status in a particular institutional organization, and therefore who is entitled to those benefits and who isn't. And whether these are issues, addressed at the national level or at the global level. Do we have reasons to maintain provision that is, for those considered citizens at national level, or should we extend it? And what is the role of migrants in these circumscribed kind of groups that institutional arrangements sometimes create? The notion of reciprocity that is at the basis of most of social contract theories, for example, can be critiqued on these issues. But I want to stop here and to see whether there are other issues that you would like to bring to the plenary, or if anybody would like to add or start a new kind of question. I see that Judith has been talking about how universal basic income connects to questions about capitalism, and now they might reproduce capitalist systems. I'm slightly more positive towards universal basic income, but I might be a dreamer without any hope of redemption. Are there other kind of questions that you would like to? Anka, yes, please. Sorry, I missed your hand.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to put in a good word for the universal basic income. I thought it was a very interesting thing to bring up because I was thinking about the obvious relevance of a good basic income rather than a bad basic income to Elaine's talk. So I totally agree with what you did in the chat. All sorts of proposals that are called the universal basic income, and some of them are meant to replace largely the welfare state. So there's probably not much to be said in favor of those suggestions, but a universal basic income which would complement rather than replace the welfare state, and which would be addressed not just to citizens but to all residents, as many people propose actually. I think that would help with several problems that came up in various talks. So a very interesting question is, what kind of basic income should children be entitled to? And there is a bit of debate, not as much as I think it's worth having, but now I'm just speculating. If children were to be recipients of the basic income in kind rather than entirely in cash, then you could imagine a scheme providing school to every basis and perhaps vouchers for children who need to buy clothes, and something in between in kind and in cash provision, which would allow children to at least relate to each other more as equals, at least in the sphere of the school, in the public sphere more generally. So I think that if such a scheme was possible and sustainable, which I don't know anything about, that would be really very good news for having less stigmatizing environments for children, even for those children whose home situation is still going to be very unequal compared to the more advantaged children. And would certainly such a policy would take much of the pressure off the professors, teachers, and parents who feel that they have to do everything they can to ensure that their children are not to lose out in the competition for social goods later on when they grow up. So I think this would be a great incentive for allowing parents to relax a bit the demands that children perform very well very early in life.
Thank you,
Anka. On the potential merits of a good basic income.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions or comments that you'd like to share with us? Tammy.
Yeah, I feel embarrassed even to talk here. I don't like the Zoom very much. So other than what I wrote about the capitalism, which I think benefits from poverty, and I think in many ways, it's hard to speak on poverty and education in general terms. It really differs in every place. Like even talking about universal basic income, are we talking about dictatorship, like some countries are being ruled by dictators? I mean, how do you cope with that? And these countries actually collaborate with Western countries, and in many ways they use kids. When you hear about kids who go to the army at the age of 9 and 10, and it's being said that they actually protect their land and tribes and property, obviously the weapon industry makes a lot of fortune and exploits children. So I think the discussion here is so broad, and it really touches only, it gives a glimpse about the issue of poverty, but it's so much complicated. And you know, also you have religious group, like in Israel there is a big debate about it. Like you have ultra-Orthodox communities in which we define them as poor. When you talk to them, they don't define themselves as poor. They prefer to live in community rather than work hard and make money, because what they really care about is community life. And so we impose on them to think of themselves in terms of poverty. At the same time, you have gender issues, women's rights and women ability to provide themselves. So I mean, Israel really has so many ethnicities and groups of people. And if I talk about poverty, it really cannot cover all the spectrum and the complexity of one tiny place with 9 million citizens. And also with the immigrants, we also have undocumented immigrants. Usually they live in poor areas, what we consider poor areas. And there is a huge tension between the local people and the undocumented immigrants. So even if you give them the rights, like in Israel, you have, we are signed on the children's rights. So you have to allow them to go to school, to public schools, undocumented children. You can't use the children against the parents. And sometimes it causes really huge tension with the local people who are already coming from their ethnicity is already consider inferior their perspective. And so they feel that, oh, so you screw up, I'm sorry for saying it in this way, all the Black people on the non-white people together. So there is a great tension over there as well. But I want to say that there is also a lot of empathy, and maybe we should talk also about caring and empathy as a feminist way to approach poverty and look at people who are considered poor as human beings and acknowledge them as equal. Because many times NPOs and all these philanthropic organizations don't treat them as equal human beings. They give them money and they look at them, oh, I did a good deed. I gave them money to the poor people. And good thing there are poor people that I can give them money and feel good about myself. Sorry for being cynical.
Thank you, Tammy. Now, on this somehow hopeful and critical note, if there are no further questions, I'm very conscious of time because it's 5 o'clock and I know that people have other commitments. So if there are no other comments or questions from the plenary, I would like to ask each of our presenters today to say just a few words about what they would like us to take away from today. And then I would like to say, let's all reconvene for the next seminar. So Anka, is there anything that you would like to share with us as your last thoughts of the day?
Maybe you remember the basic income comment as my last thought of the day, but let me also thank you very much for having me here, and I learned a lot from every presentation. Thank you so much. I may get in touch if that's okay with presenters for slides.
We will write to presenters because we said that we would record the sessions and a message will arrive, and certainly we will be providing people who request this. More on this later on. Thank you, Anka, very much for accepting our invitation. Elaine Chase, would you like to say anything as your thought of the day for
thought of the day? So many thoughts, like Anka, really enjoyed the session, and so many really nice points I think of crossover and points to kind of develop further, and conversations still to be had. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for organizing it.
Thank you for your participation as well. And we've got now Rachel and Eve.
Yeah, thanks very much for the event and for the prompt. I think the invitation to speak and think has given Eve and I a lot of fruit for our own conversations, and it's been really nice to discuss them here with you today. So I think it's a really important topic, and important to kind of critically unpack questions of childhood and representations of poverty and experiences of impoverishment. So thank you.
Thank you. And we certainly have had a very interesting array of discussions on the status of children in different ways today, as well as, although not so focused in previous seminars. Eve, did you want to say anything yourself, or?
Just that Anka's point earlier made me think about the way that welfare benefits on behalf of children are always kind of given to parents, and you know, thinking about families with no recourse to public funds, what matters is the parent status. So it doesn't really matter, you know, the citizenship or the status of the child. It's very much based on the parents. So I think that's an interesting thing for our conversations as well to think about.
Well, that leads to some elements of special status for children to be reconsidered. That is my point, but thank you so much, Eve, as well. Jenny, over to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of echo the points of others. I think the threads between, and this I think run through all the seminar series, that you have these presentations around things that don't necessarily seem that connected with each other, and then there's these really interesting threads between them. But also for me, I think the other thing, and I'm not a philosopher, and it's very, and I know others here aren't philosophers as well, but I find myself getting very immersed in the empirical, the kind of the data, and what's really interesting is to be with the kind of questions that people ask here that kind of make you stand back from it and give pause to these kind of normative questions that I find quite intimidating sometimes. There's such big questions to be answering about childhood, about poverty, about education. So very honoured to be invited to sort of think about that. I feel like it's a discussion to continue and lots to reflect on. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you again to all of you, to our distinguished speakers and our participants. We hope that this kind of seminar provides really the kind of environment to start addressing those questions together, those big normative questions together from different perspectives. And again, a very, very grateful acknowledgement of all your inputs today. Brilliant, inspiring, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next seminar, which will be the 5th of 6 seminars. So we are coming to an end, but moving on with great ideas. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for being here and for contributing so brilliantly.
Elaine, I've just seen your message there, so I just wanted to say that's fine if you want to pick up on that later.
Could we maybe do some emailing or something? Because I guess all our brains are a bit expanded, but and I don't really know about Slack, but I know it's a chat space. So yeah, maybe we could just email each other.
Yeah, that's fine.
Judith and I would kick it around and.
Yeah, because there's always so much to discuss, isn't there? And then you run out of time. And I'm involved in a couple of different spaces on Slack where precisely this has happened, where a kind of little community of people have been formed around the conference, and you kind of want a further way of discussing things as they come to you later. So Slack has been quite a good space for that. So I'd be happy to help put something together. If it's really easy to do, and it doesn't take much administration or anything. So
are you offering to convene it, Gary?
Yeah, I think I am.
Be volunteered now. Coerced to volunteer.
Because I mean, it does need someone to sort of do the technical, the moderating, the setting it up. If I don't want to, if you're offering to do that, I think that would be great. Yeah. But we'll talk about it and get back to you. Thanks very much for suggesting that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And on a much more trivial note, I was actually admiring your background, thinking, is that a true background or is it a kind of Zoom background?
No, this is my front garden.
We can hear the birds. We can hear the bird song.
Yeah, I thought I'd come outside for the rest of the session because I live in Scotland and it doesn't look like this very often. So.
But that's lovely. I am actually very envious. I was there thinking, should I actually mention this? And then I restrained myself from mentioning it in the comment. Didn't seem to be terribly appropriate, but I was there very envious.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not our image of Scotland. It's too sunny and
it's beautiful.
Looks lovely.
If I'd done the same yesterday, like I say, it wouldn't look like this. So you have to make hay while the sun shines, as they say.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much for your contributions, Gary. It's really appreciated.
You too. It's a great seminar series. So thank you very much for putting it together. And yeah, let's stay in touch about the Slack idea. That's fine.
Okay, brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Right. I'm so sorry for my. Oh God, I was completely panicking. It would.
Wonderful, Lorella. I don't know. how you did it, but you were just brilliant. You were on top of it. You chaired it beautifully, and wow.
Thank you, but my goodness, thank you. I really panicked. I had prepared a much more thoughtful introduction, but I was just losing it, as I sometimes do. Zoom would not recognize me. And I said, okay, I started at 22. If it doesn't recognize me, I've got to uninstall and install it again. And there was no way, kept coming back to me. This is, anyway, it's over. I hope that I will find a way. I will practice before next seminar. But I was very pleased with today's presentations, as well as, you know, contributions. We seem to have a core group of people accessing the seminar on a regular basis, which is somehow what we wanted. And yeah, it was very interesting. And again, it's a wide range of issues, but all interconnected. So it seemed to be really, really great.
Yeah, I thought they were excellent. I really thought I thought Elaine's and Rachel's presentations particularly were really powerful. And it's interesting to have someone like Anke opening up with these very abstract conceptual frameworks and then dive into these sort of qualitative, you know, details. And I think,
and somehow we sort of need to put I mean, it was very juxtaposed when they were beside each other.
Yeah.
Then you see that what her assumptions are so completely different, you know, like Jenny
exactly
about sexual innocence with,
that completely got thrown into the, like when Jenny did her talk, that just suddenly kind of brought all that out.
Yeah. And also all that, well, the kind of liberal education ideal of the creative child and things like that. And then these children who are barely able to eat. And so it was very, very interesting, the juxtaposition.
Yeah, the challenge is to bring those two perspectives together. It's almost like it's two different languages that's
right.
Speaking.
But also how they were talking of the normative. When Jenny talked about her normative, it's a very different conception of the normative.
Sociological conception of normative, and you have an ethical conception of. I mean, maybe that's what I should talk about. Yeah. It's really interesting how both of those words are used, yeah.
And also how the different considerations about the status of children. But yet I kept bringing her back, Anka, into the discussion, because I really would have wanted people to appreciate the value in thinking about the value of childhood. And there was a moment when I was about to say, I feel very self-conscious about having, entitled our seminar series, Child Poverty and Education. Because there are questions about that too, but in another way, you could counter-argue Eve's position, and because you could say, well, hang on a second, yes, it is true that you have you cannot make an exceptionalism of the position of children, but at the same time, childhood requires some specific policies that are not the same that you would apply to adults. And unless we recognize that, we then risk the other thing, which is completely obscuring the specific of childhood, which I think would be a terrible mistake. So I do, because I'm so biased towards liberal views, I do continue to think that what Anka was saying has very strong relevance for how we should think. Perhaps ideally, I'm not sure in real circumstances, but certainly there is value in what she's proposing. But that's me. I mean, it's beyond what we want to discuss. I don't know.
But also focusing on child poverty forces you to think about the underpinnings of the normative frameworks for justice, because they force you to think about the family as a unit, and what goes on within the family and how that sits within the bigger political question. Whereas if you just talk about poverty as you know, about adults, then you don't have to kind of see how that plays out. So but yeah, these are all so complicated, these questions. I've started trying to think about my talk, and I'm getting caught up in all these complicated conceptual questions, so not sure how I'm going to disentangle it. But
just alert me to the date of the next one.
Is the 13th of May? I'll get back to you, but I think it's the 13th of May. Let me just have a look at my diary.
Yeah, that's right. It's the 13th.
Yes, the 13th.
And you
of
asked,
May.
You said you want titles confirmed by the 5th, I think.
Yeah, I am allowing some delays because no one is ever on time with the titles.
No.
And then it becomes an issue to disseminate the program.
Right.
And therefore, I wanted those titles. But consider that you've got a couple of days of leeway, right?
No, I'll have a title before then. It's a question of having the talk. But I see Arathi got back to us already with a title, which sounds great.
Yeah, I replied to her. And
yeah,
then
I saw that. Yeah,
my reply. So I think, listen, I think that we should see this as a space for the development and the discussion of ideas rather than for presenting fully formed papers, because this is what we originally thought. So I was very much in trouble in order to think about what should I be presenting. But I think that if you see that there's a space for discussion rather than I'm going to present a fully polished paper that will be published as it is, it becomes a less challenging and perhaps less daunting task.
I think that's true. And I think some of the best presentations we've had have done that, have just, you know, like if you remember James Wilson's, then he just put these kind of questions out there as a series of thoughts about.
But James was very good. James is a very good philosopher, right?
Yeah.
But it's also true that when you have a very closed and organized paper, this is something that somebody told me once, and I think they're right. Questions are more limited because the paper is coherent. If you throw out some ideas that may not be so coherently and logically, I mean, logically, yes, but may not be so well articulated in a coherent argument, you may get more interesting questions and a more lively engagement. I don't know. These are just thoughts that occurred to me whilst I was in my own soul searching of what am I going to say amidst many other questions of everyday.
I have to take this call, but could I run whatever I think past you before it becomes the title?
With pleasure, whatever.
Lots of different free-floating ideas, and I've got to pin them in some way.
No, I'd really like that. That would be great to have that.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. I was very tempted to ask you, and then I said, don't be yourself all the time panicking. And so I prevented myself from doing so. But I think that if you wanted, for sure.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
And you want me to write the thank you letters quickly?
If you don't mind, Elaine, would you mind? I mean, would you have the time?
That's fine. I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah.
Excellent. That's very, very helpful. And then one other point, not now, because I know that we will have to talk about the suggestion from the journal, because it has come back quite positively, right, Judith?
Yes, so the initial response from David was very enthusiastic, but I haven't heard back from the editorial team about, you know, schedules and length and everything, but they're really keen to have something from us. Yeah.
Good. Have they met already? You don't know.
I think they have. Yeah.
Well,
so
they might be there in the process of you know, putting together the ideas. Let's have a look at what comes back, and then we'll think. You know, there's another opportunity with James. Elaine, I know you have to go. Thank you very much.
Say thanks.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Elaine. And Judith, we may then reconsider, you know, what we can do in relation to a possible publication. And I am aware that I have to write to people about sharing their slides and about to speakers about sharing their slides and so on.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. You're okay, Judith?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
You had your second jab now.
I have had. I did react to the second jab. I had to stay in bed. Yeah. Yeah. It was. I'm delighted that I had my second jab. I was silly enough not to check whether I had. I never take anything because I don't like paracetamol, ibuprofen have some negative effects. And I realized that I didn't have any paracetamol, and my next door neighbor, who is so kind in helping me, was away, and she had forewarned me, but I forgot. So I stayed in bed, and in about a day and a half, I felt better. But at the beginning, I was quite under the weather.
Did you have a fever?
Yes, a little bit. Not quite a fever, but I was proper flu, aching, muscle pain, joint pain, terrible headache.
And is this with the Pfizer or the AstraZeneca?
Pfizer.
Wow, that's interesting, because I haven't heard of many people having side effects with Pfizer. I know from the AstraZeneca.
It might have been that I arrived there really tired. And maybe I wasn't, but yes, I had an effect. But, you know, they also say that it's very individual and that it might be a sign that your system is responding.
Yeah,
so it's producing. I hope that that's a good explanation. But I'm better now. I'm a bit tired. I'm under usual pressure, but it's okay. And yeah, sorry, Judith, for the problem with Zoom. I was really.
No, it's not your fault. It's probably because you have a new laptop. It probably didn't recognize your details.
I was on Zoom yesterday for meetings.
That's really strange. Well, hopefully it won't happen next time.
No, I will. You know, I will log in at 1:30 anyway. Yeah.
But listen, if you ever get stuck with something like that, with needing paracetamol or anything, you can always call me. I'm not that far away, and I have a car. I'm here with the car. So
thank you so much. I'm so self-reliant, Judith, that I never think about asking other people.
It's a terrible trait, Lorella. You need to ask for help.
I'm so sorry. I will, but thank you so much.
I know that trait, and yeah, no, but really, if you don't hesitate, if you get stuck and you need anything,
and you too, compatible with my restrictions, which, however, will be slightly, I hope, easing off. But
I hope, yeah, I hope so.
Not completely, yeah.
Okay, well, this has been really excellent. So thanks for all your great sharing, and I'll be in touch before the next.
Excellent. And we'll talk more and we'll move on, and then we'll see. Okay, Judy, thank you so much for everything and for dealing with all the technical issues. I'm so glad you're doing that, because I think I would panic unreservedly.
I'm becoming an expert at it now.
You are. Okay. I'm impressed. And by the way, there were between 30 and 22 participants. So we are reaching our target audience very nicely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.